You're alone, but not in the way people usually mean it. You're surrounded by others, talking, laughing, making plans. You reply, you smile, you perform, but none of it touches you. Not really. It's like your words travel through glass, bouncing back without ever reaching another person. You feel invisible, even as you're being seen. You feel unheard, even as your voice fills the air. And then you realize something even more unsettling. You've been like this for weeks, maybe months, maybe longer, and no one has noticed. They don't ask. They don't pull you aside. They don't look at you long enough to see it. You're still playing your part, after all, still showing up, still functioning. You eat, you sleep, you laugh when required. But inside, it's quiet, hollow, distant. This isn't sadness. It's something else. It's a slow disappearance. Not all at once, but bit by bit, a kind of emotional erosion. You still remember what it felt like to care, to connect, to feel joy or fear or hope. But now, those things seem far away, not gone, just unreachable, like remembering warmth after being cold for too long. You're not drowning in water, but you are drowning. You're overwhelmed, but no one sees it. Because your face looks fine, because your voice sounds steady, because you've learned how to mimic the surface of being okay. And somehow, that's worse than breaking down. Because if you screamed, at least someone might turn and look. But silence gets nothing. This kind of drowning doesn't make a sound. It doesn't leave visible bruises. It doesn't shatter glass or draw crowds. It just pulls you slowly inward until you forget what air even felt like. Until you stop reaching out for help, not because you don't want it, but because you don't believe it would matter. And maybe the most disturbing part is that you can't point to a cause. There's no clear trauma, no singular grief, just an accumulation. Tiny moments of disconnection, minor rejections, daily humiliations so small no one else would notice. But they pile up. They start to weigh more than you expected. So you stop talking about how you feel. You stop trying to explain what can't be seen. You convince yourself that everyone else is handling life just fine, that you're the only one sinking, that maybe this is just who you are now. And still, you go to work. You text people back. You smile when you're supposed to. But inside, you're slipping further and further down, and no one reaches out. No one grabs your hand, because no one knows they should. They think you're fine. They always think you're fine. And you start to wonder, what if this never changes? What if the rest of your life is just this silent struggle to keep your head above water, pretending you're not already submerged? You begin to understand how a person can disappear without anyone noticing. How someone can walk into a room and feel more alone than if they'd stayed home. How despair isn't always loud or dramatic. It's often quiet, numb, still. And then, one night, you lie awake, staring at the ceiling, and you ask yourself the question that scares you most. If I vanished tomorrow, who would notice the absence, not just my presence? Would they miss me, or just the role I played? Would anyone feel the difference between me being alive and me being gone? And you can't answer. Not confidently, not honestly. That's when you know you're not just drowning, you're already underwater, and no one even saw you fall. You remember closing the door. You remember locking it, turning the key, tugging, once to make sure it held. You remember the exact moment, the click, the sound, the feeling of safety. But later, when the door is wide open, the lock unturned and your house ransacked, none of it makes sense. You remember something that didn't happen, or something happened that doesn't match what you remember. So which is it? Is your memory wrong, or is the world lying to you? This isn't a rare glitch. It happens more often than you notice. A word you're sure someone said, a face you swear you saw, a moment you remember with absolute certainty, but that no one else recalls. And every time it happens, a quiet discomfort rises inside you, because memory is supposed to be proof. It's supposed to be what keeps you anchored. And yet, it turns out it isn't a recording. It's a story, a reconstruction. And sometimes it's completely false, but not randomly false. That would be easier. These aren't just gaps or blanks. These are full, vivid recollections of things that never occurred. Not hazy guesses, not fragments, real memories with details. Emotions, context. You can close your eyes and see it happen. You can feel it. And yet, it didn't. So what are you supposed to trust? There are people who remember entire conversations that never happened. Rooms they've never entered. Childhood events no one else recalls. Sometimes they're harmless. Sometimes they tear families apart. Because it's not just a misremembered date or name. It's the deep belief that you were wronged. That something terrible happened to you. That someone betrayed you. And your memory makes it real, but then you're told it didn't happen. Not by one person, by many. You're told there are no records, no evidence, no possibility, and suddenly your mind splits. Because you know what you remember, but you also know memory is fallible. So where does that leave you? You start to doubt yourself, not just the memory. You begin to question your mind, your stability, your grip on reality. You wonder how many other things you believe are wrong. You start checking, rechecking, asking, replaying. The more you question, the less sure you become. And then it gets worse, because sometimes you realize you're not alone. Someone else remembers it too. The same false event, the same impossible detail. It confirms your memory, but deepens the mystery. How can two people misremember the same lie? How can the same fake memory be shared? They call it the Mandela effect. But giving it a name doesn't make it less disturbing. It just makes it easier to dismiss. You tell yourself it's a trick of the brain, a cognitive error. But deep down, it doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels like something else, like something you're not supposed to notice. A crack, a shift, a glimpse of something unstable. You try to ignore it, you try to move on, but it stays. Lurking, not the memory itself, but the realization that your mind is not a reliable witness. That truth is not something you can verify by feeling it strongly enough. And this doesn't stop with memory, it spreads. If your past can be wrong, what about your identity, your beliefs, your decisions? How many things do you trust simply because you remember them clearly? How much of who you are is built on things that never actually happened? It creates a kind of quiet terror. The fear, not that someone else is lying, but that you are, without knowing it. That everything you say with confidence might be false. That every certainty you hold might be fiction. You don't notice how much this changes you at first. But slowly, it shapes how you speak, how you argue, how you relate to others. You hesitate more, you qualify things. You begin to say, I think instead of I know. And when someone challenges your version of the past, you don't fight as hard, because somewhere inside, you've accepted the possibility that they might be right. Or at least, that you might be wrong, and then something else happens. You begin to see it in others. The small contradictions in their stories. The inconsistencies in what they claim to remember. And you stop assuming they're lying. You start wondering if they believe it, just like you believed your own errors. And that's when the real shift happens. You realize the past is not something anyone truly agrees on. It's not a shared archive, it's a set of individual reconstructions. And each one is vulnerable, subject to change, subject to distortion. subject to total invention. And if memory can't be trusted, what can? You turn to evidence. Photographs, recordings, documents. But even those can be manipulated, misinterpreted, taken out of context. And more importantly, they don't always exist. Most of life isn't documented. Most of your past lives only in your mind. So now you're left in a strange place. A place where nothing is completely secure, not even your own experiences. A place where truth isn't lost, it's never fully known to begin with. You tell yourself you're being honest. You feel the words forming in your throat, deliberate, measured, careful. But even as you speak them, something feels off. A small hesitation. A split-second calculation. Not a lie, exactly, not yet. But not the full truth either. Because the harder you try to be honest, the more aware you become of how much there is to hide. Every detail you reveal makes you responsible for it. Every truth you speak opens you to judgment, to rejection, to consequences. So you adjust, you soften, you reframe, you omit. You start to wonder what honesty really means, if it's the raw, unfiltered truth, or just a cleaner version of yourself you're willing to share. And this effort, this tightening grip on truth, doesn't set you free. It traps you. The more you try to be completely honest, the more complex and distorted your honesty becomes. You say you want to be transparent, but what you really want is to be accepted. You want truth, but only the kind that doesn't cost too much. So you begin to curate it. You emphasize certain parts. You bury others. You turn facts into stories, stories into justifications. And still, you call it honesty. You believe you're telling the truth because you feel sincere. You believe your words are honest because your intentions are good. But sincerity and truth aren't the same. Good intentions don't erase omissions. And every time you try harder to explain yourself clearly, you find yourself drifting further from something real. Because pure truth is unbearable. It's sharp. It's ugly. It doesn't ask if the other person is ready to hear it. It doesn't protect anyone's feelings, including your own. Pure truth forces you to expose not just what happened, but what you felt. What you feared, what you wanted, and didn't say out loud. And most people don't want that from you. Most people want comfort. They want assurance. They want a version of you that makes them feel safe. So you begin to shape your truth into something softer, something easier, something useful. You say you're just being tactful, just being kind. But deep down, you know you're not being fully honest. You're just avoiding the fallout of truth. And here's where it gets worse. The more you care about being honest, the more self-aware you become. You watch your own thoughts. You question your memories. You edit your words as you speak them, anticipating how they'll be received. You try to account for every bias, every misunderstanding, every possible misinterpretation. And in trying so hard to get it right, you stop being real. Your honesty becomes a performance, a strategy. You start explaining your thoughts instead of simply expressing them. You narrate your motives, your fears, your contradictions, desperately trying to prove that you're not hiding anything. But in doing so, you clutter the truth with noise. You bury the simplicity of what's real under a pile of explanations meant to protect you. And the more you explain, the more suspicious you sound. The more effort you put into proving your honesty, the less people believe you. Because real truth doesn't beg to be trusted. It doesn't try to convince. It just is. So now, you're stuck. If you're too careful, your honesty feels hollow. If you're too raw, your honesty becomes cruel. If you balance the two, your honesty becomes manipulative, something shaped to achieve a desired reaction. And suddenly, you see it. There is no perfect honesty, No pure, unfiltered truth that doesn't distort itself the moment it leaves your mouth. Because every word is chosen, every silence is a choice. And the more you try to get it right, the more your truth becomes calculated, artificial, and strategic. Even the phrase, "I'm just being honest," is usually a warning, an excuse for something harsh, something self-serving, something that pushes the burden of truth onto someone else. And yet we say it with pride, as if honesty itself justifies everything that follows. But maybe the real truth is this: you don't lie because you're careless. You lie because you care too much. About being understood, about being forgiven, about being seen a certain way. Your lies aren't malicious, they're protective. They're shields you build around the parts of yourself that feel too ugly, too complicated, too dangerous to show. And when you finally decide to tear those shields down, to be completely honest, you don't become free. You just become vulnerable, exposed, at risk of being misunderstood, rejected, or hurt in ways you can't undo. That's the part we don't admit, that honesty isn't some noble act of moral strength. It's a terrifying loss of control. It means handing someone else the power to hurt you with the truth you just gave them. And that's why the harder you try to be honest, the more you lie. Not because you want to deceive, but because truth in its purest form demands a kind of surrender you're not sure you're ready for. And maybe you never will be. What if you never really existed until someone else noticed you? Not physically, but in the deeper sense. In the way you matter, the way you mean something. You walk through the world thinking you're an individual, complete and self-contained. But then someone looks at you a certain way. They respond to your tone, they laugh at your joke, they interpret your silence, and suddenly you become something different. Their version of you. Maybe you don't realize how often this happens. How much of your identity is actually constructed outside of you. You think your thoughts are private, your self-image, self-determined. But everything from how you walk, to what you believe, to how you see your past, none of it stands on its own. It's all shaped by how others reflect you back. You've changed the way you speak depending on who's listening. You've felt smarter, or dumber, or more confident, depending on the room you're in. That's not just social behavior. That's your identity mutating. You don't have one fixed self. You're made of mirrors, bent, incomplete, unreliable, without others. There's nothing to reflect. No shape, no context. Just absence. Imagine growing up completely alone. No parents, no language. Could you even form a sense of self? Would you still feel like a person, or just a presence? You might have instincts, sensations, fears, but would you have values? A personality, a name? Even your memories aren't just yours. They're edited and reinforced by others, by how they remember them, how they talk about them, how they respond when you bring them up. Over time, your story changes without your permission, not because you forgot it, but because other people remembered it differently. You start to adopt their version. Their version becomes your truth. It's possible to be alive, to breathe, to think, and still not exist in the way you think you do. Because so much of your existence depends on being seen, on being understood, misunderstood, judged, needed, rejected. If no one expects anything from you, who are you performing for? If no one remembers you, who do you imagine yourself to be? You can feel it in relationships. How easily you become the person they expect you to be. How a certain look or word can make you shrink, or swell, or disappear. You react to their perception, and it feels like choice, but it's really adaptation. You're not changing who you are. You're discovering that who you are depends entirely on who's watching. And when no one's watching, you fade. Not physically, but in presence, in certainty, that quiet, gnawing feeling when you're alone, not just lonely, but undefined. Like a book no one's reading, you begin to question everything. Your motives, your preferences, even your memories start to feel vague, as if they don't quite belong to you. Some people spend their entire lives trying to be seen clearly, trying to escape all the projections, the misunderstandings. But what if that's not possible? What if you're not a single self waiting to be found, but a set of possibilities shaped by everyone you meet? You might resist this idea. Insist that you know who you are, that you don't need others to define you. But then, why does rejection hurt so much? Why does being misunderstood feel like erasure? Why do we crave validation, not just emotionally, but existentially? It's not vanity, it's not weakness, it's structural. You can't build an identity alone. You need feedback, you need response, you need contradiction. And without it, you become unformed, quietly, invisibly lost, and that's the trap. You need others to exist, but they will never see you fully. They will always distort you, misread you, use you to fill their own gaps. Every version of you that lives in someone else's mind is wrong, and yet it's also the only version that survives. So you try to control the distortion. You curate, you edit, you present. You try to be seen in the right way, to be understood the way you want. But it's exhausting, because no matter what you do, they still invent their own version of you. Even your silence becomes part of their story. Even your absence leaves an impression. You are multiplied constantly, fragmented, reduced, and those fragments walk around in the minds of others, acting on your behalf, making decisions you didn't choose, saying things you never said. And the worst part is, they might be more real to others than the actual you, because perception becomes memory. Memory becomes narrative. Narrative becomes truth. And somewhere in that process, the real you is overwritten again and again. Maybe that's why some people feel invisible. Not because they aren't seen, but because they're only ever seen incorrectly. They exist in fragments that don't match how they feel inside. And after a while, they start to wonder if the inside version even matters. If no one can access it, does it still count? You need others to exist, but they will never see you clearly. And you will never fully see them either. All we ever hold are approximations, glimpses, versions. And maybe that's the loneliest truth of all, that you will never fully exist in any one place, in any one mind, only pieces, only echoes. And even those will disappear when they forget you. What if you could only live freely by obeying, not once or sometimes, but always, every action, every word, every thought carefully aligned with a rule you didn't create? What if the only way to move through the world without punishment, pain, or loss was complete submission? At first, it feels wrong. You equate freedom with rebellion, autonomy, choice, the ability to decide for yourself, to shape your life without constraint. That's what freedom means, isn't it? Doing what you want, when you want, how you want. But that version of freedom is fragile, unsustainable. It shatters the moment your desires conflict with someone else's. The moment your choices cause harm. Imagine a city with no laws, no red lights, no speed limits, no restrictions. Everyone drives however they want. That sounds like chaos, not freedom. Your safety depends on others, obeying rules, the rules you didn't write, that you may not even agree with. But without them, you can't move without fear. You're not free, you're vulnerable, powerless, so you obey, quietly, repeatedly. You learn that certain freedoms, like walking safely across a street, only exist when everyone else limits theirs. Your freedom is built from other people's restraint, and theirs from yours. You begin to realize that the rules aren't the opposite of freedom. They are its structure. Still, something inside resists. You imagine being told what to do, how to live, who to be. The idea makes you bristle, but then you look at your life more closely. You already follow rules every day. You wait in lines, you stop at signs. You speak in ways that are socially acceptable, emotionally safe. You monitor your tone, your words, your timing. You obey social codes so invisibly that you mistake them for choice. And when someone breaks those rules, cuts in line, speaks too loudly, insults without shame, it doesn't feel like they're freer, it feels like they're dangerous, or lost, or broken. So maybe the rules aren't cages. Maybe they're coordinates. Invisible lines guiding you through complexity. Anchors in a world too uncertain to navigate alone. But then comes the harder question. What if you follow rules not out of reason, but fear? What if obedience becomes reflex, not choice? You do what you're told, not because it makes sense, but because you've learned that disobedience leads to rejection, punishment, isolation. You call it discipline, but is it? You might think you're choosing, but maybe you've never really stopped to consider what would happen if you didn't. Maybe you've shaped your whole life around what's allowed, what's expected. Maybe the idea of breaking a rule doesn't even cross your mind anymore, because that freedom, the one without limits, terrifies you. Because freedom isn't safety, it isn't comfort, it isn't peace. True freedom is heavy. It requires responsibility, courage, the ability to act without guidance and still live with the consequences. And that kind of freedom is unbearable for most people, so they trade it, quietly, for rules, for structure, for certainty. And slowly the rules become internal. You don't need enforcement anymore. You've already absorbed the punishments, the corrections, the shame. You don't step out of line because the line lives inside you. You monitor yourself constantly. You call it maturity. But maybe it's just adaptation. Now ask yourself if every action you take is shaped by rules, social, moral, legal, personal. Where is your freedom? What part of you remains untouched, unscripted, undirected? If you removed every rule from your life, what would be left? Who would you be? And here's where the contradiction sharpens. Without rules, you lose structure. But with them, you lose spontaneity. Without rules, you risk chaos. But with them, you risk stagnation. You want to be free, but you also want to be safe. You want possibility, but also order. You crave both, even though they cancel each other out. So maybe true freedom isn't the absence of rules. Maybe it's knowing which ones to follow, and when. Maybe it's obeying on purpose, not from fear, not from habit, but from clarity. Maybe freedom is the ability to submit willingly, not because you must, because you understand. But even that is a rule about rules, a rule about freedom. And now the whole idea begins to collapse. You can't escape the structure. Even freedom has a framework. Even rebellion follows a script. So you're left with this quiet, uncomfortable truth. Maybe you were never free at all. Maybe freedom was just the name you gave to your favorite kind of obedience. What if everything you've learned, every fact, every theory, every answer wasn't bringing you closer to the truth, but pulling you further away from it? Not because it's false, but because it's too much. The more you know, the less you understand. It begins with something small. You read an article. You watch a documentary. You talk to someone with a different background. And suddenly what once felt obvious, felt stable, becomes strange, complicated, contested. You realize how little you'd actually considered before, how much you'd simplify just to function. At first it feels like clarity, the excitement of discovery. You feel smarter, wiser, more in control. But then it doesn't stop, you learn more. And the things you thought you understood begin to unravel. History turns into a network of contradictions. Psychology becomes a maze of biases. Morality starts to fracture into context, culture, consequence. And every new insight doesn't answer a question. It replaces it with 5 more. You begin to hesitate. Conversations feel heavier. Decisions feel slower. You used to know what was right, what was good, what made sense. Now every choice carries an invisible weight. What you're missing, what you're ignoring, who benefits, who suffers. You used to think you saw the world clearly. Now you see how much you never saw at all. And then something worse happens. You start to realize that knowledge isn't just incomplete, it's incompatible. 2 experts, same field, opposite conclusions. 2 models, both predictive, mutually exclusive. 2 truths, each supported by evidence, each denying the other. You don't know how to choose between them. So you keep reading, keep searching. But the more you try to resolve it, the deeper you fall into contradiction. And now understanding becomes impossible. You can recite the data, the theories, the counter-arguments, but you no longer believe in the coherence of any of it. You can explain everything and nothing. You begin to envy ignorance, not because it's blissful, but because it's directional. It moves, it acts, it believes. You remember what it felt like to be sure, to have conviction, to speak without constantly second-guessing. But now you see conviction for what it often is, an illusion of completeness built on the refusal to look deeper. And that knowledge poisons you, not visibly, quietly. You stop arguing, not because you've given up, but because you see how futile it is. You see how every position rests on 1,000 assumptions, how no one is actually talking about the same thing, how every debate is just a performance of unspoken values, unresolvable, repeating. You don't trust simplicity anymore, but you also don't trust your distrust, because that too is a position, a stance, a belief. And then it gets harder. You start seeing it in yourself. You change your mind so often, you lose track of what you actually believe. You see through your own arguments as you make them. You recognize your flaws as you speak them aloud, and it doesn't stop you from performing them anyway. You start to fragment. You become many versions of yourself. One who knows, one who doubts, one who pretends not to care, one who misses the certainty you once mocked. You wonder if there's a limit, if there's a point where learning stops making you wiser, if there's a point where knowledge stops clarifying and starts erasing. You don't say it out loud. It sounds dangerous, anti-intellectual, but you feel it. You feel how knowledge, past a certain point, doesn't free you. It collapses you into caution, into paralysis, into endless qualification. And then you notice something else. There are people who know far less than you, but they lead, they act, they influence. Not because they're right, but because they aren't burdened by all the things they don't know. They move fast because they don't see the trap. And you, standing at the edge of that trap, realize that seeing it doesn't save you, it only stops you. Because knowing the complexity of a problem doesn't give you the solution. It only takes away the illusion that a solution is simple. You don't want to go back, but you're not sure how to go forward either. You want to believe that understanding is still possible, that there's value in the complexity, that some kind of clarity will emerge from the chaos. But it doesn't, not completely. And the most terrifying part isn't that the world is unknowable. It's that you're starting to understand it just enough to see that you never truly will. How do you explain the fact that people answer faster when they're wrong? Not just sometimes, not just in a rush, but reliably, consistently, Across studies and situations, wrong answers come faster. They arrive almost instantly. Quick, confident, automatic. Right answers, in contrast, tend to take longer. They stumble into the mind with hesitation, doubt, and delay. That should feel strange. We like to think that being wrong is what happens when we don't think enough. When we rush, get distracted, or act emotionally. We assume that if someone just slowed down and thought more carefully, they'd be right. That error is the absence of thought. But maybe that's not true. Maybe wrong answers don't come from too little thinking. Maybe they come from the wrong kind of thinking. Fast, intuitive, familiar. The kind that's already waiting for you before the question is even finished. The kind that feels like remembering, even when it's just guessing. That kind of thinking feels effortless. It gives you a feeling of certainty, even when you're completely off. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like a fact. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Because your mind isn't just calculating. It's constantly trying to be efficient. It wants to reduce uncertainty, relieve tension, solve things quickly so it can move on. So when you encounter something confusing, something unfamiliar or hard to understand, it offers you the easiest possible answer. The one that fits your existing beliefs. The one that doesn't require you to change. You accept it, not because it's right, but because it's fast, because it feels right. And then it's locked in. By the time you start actually thinking, your brain has already committed. It's already decided. And any new information you encounter now has to fight its way in. Not as a possibility to consider, but as a threat to defend against. This is why you feel resistance when someone challenges your opinion. Why facts don't always change your mind. Because your mind isn't searching for truth, it's just trying to protect the answer it already gave you. And that answer, it probably came in the first few seconds, before you even realized it. There's something deeply uncomfortable about this. It means that your confidence is often highest when you've done the least thinking. That your instincts, your immediate reactions, your gut feelings are often wrong. Not because they're stupid, but because they're too fast. They're shortcuts, built from past experience, emotion, and pattern recognition. Useful for surviving, terrible for understanding. This raises a deeper problem. If you answer faster when you're wrong and slower when you're right, how can you trust your instincts at all? You can't feel the difference between a fast answer that's right and a fast answer that's wrong. They feel the same in your mind. Immediate, certain, comfortable. You only notice the error when it's exposed, when someone points it out, when the results contradict you, when you're forced to revisit your reasoning. But most of the time, that doesn't happen. Most of the time, your fast answer just stays. It becomes part of what you believe, part of what you know. And now the falsehood isn't just a mistake. It's embedded in your identity. You'll defend it. You'll justify it. You'll find ways to keep believing it, even when you know better. Because changing it would mean admitting that your initial certainty was misplaced, that your first instinct was wrong, that your confidence wasn't earned. And most people won't do that. They'd rather stay wrong than feel uncertain. They'd rather keep believing than admit they didn't think enough. And the longer they've believed it, the harder it is to let go. So wrongness isn't just about accuracy. It's about speed. The faster it comes, the deeper it digs in. The less likely you are to question it later. This is why slow thinking matters. Not because it guarantees truth, but because it gives you space. Space to notice your bias. Space to ask whether your confidence is justified. Space to resist the urge to settle for the first answer that feels easy. It's not natural. It doesn't feel good. It feels uncertain, effortful, uncomfortable. But it's the only way to know whether your answer is real or just fast. And maybe that's the problem. You don't want to think slowly. You don't want to sit in doubt. You want to be sure. And the faster your mind can give you that feeling, the better it feels. Even if it's wrong. Especially if it's wrong. Because the mind doesn't reward accuracy. It rewards closure. And closure comes fastest when you stop thinking. So maybe the real danger isn't that you think too little. It's that you think just enough to feel right, and then stop. And by the time you realize it, you're already moving on, confident, certain, and completely wrong. You think you understand what's happening. You see the signs, the consequences, the patterns, and you think you're ahead of it. But what if you're not seeing the future at all? What if you're just deeply misunderstanding the present? Not in a simple way, not in the way of being wrong about a fact, but in a deeper way, like staring at an image that doesn't move but suddenly shifts when you tilt your head. And once you see it differently, you can't unsee it. The mind doesn't process reality directly. It filters, edits, interprets, it fills in gaps, resolves ambiguities. So what you're seeing, what you think is happening, is already a version, a translation. And that translation is what your future is being built upon. You react to things not as they are, but as they seem. You plan based on what you believe people meant, what you assume they'll do. You imagine what's coming next because of what you believe is happening now. But if the present is misunderstood completely, fundamentally, then so is the future you think you're walking into. Take relationships. You sense someone pulling away. You feel the distance, the silence, the shift in tone. And so you begin to prepare for an ending. You start to detach, protect yourself, rehearse conversations you haven't had yet. You act on a future you believe is inevitable. But what if they weren't pulling away? What if they were afraid? What if they were waiting for you to notice they were struggling? Your reading of the present rewrites your path, and in doing so you help create the future you feared. Not because it was fated, but because you misunderstood the moment, or take trust. You see someone hesitate, their eyes shift, their words come slower. You begin to suspect they're hiding something, so you ask fewer questions. You act colder. They feel the distance and respond in kind. Slowly, distrust becomes mutual. You saw it coming, but did it ever exist before you predicted it? In your mind, you were seeing forward. In reality, you were building backward from a flawed assumption. This isn't about pessimism or optimism. It's about the quiet, unnoticed places where interpretation becomes fate. The present is rarely clear. So your brain guesses, and that guess, if wrong, isn't just a momentary error, it's a trajectory. When you think someone dislikes you, you behave differently. When you think you're losing, you retreat. When you think the worst is coming, you brace for it. And in each case, you adjust your actions to a future that might not have been real until your adjustment made it real. You didn't see the future. You helped create it. Based on a false present, you can't see someone's intentions. You can't hear their thoughts. You don't know why they're quiet, or why they left, or why they changed. But your mind hates ambiguity. So it fills in the gaps. It tells you a story, and you believe it. You don't feel like you're guessing. You feel like you know, and so your predictions feel accurate. But only because you make them come true. You start living in defense of futures that were never going to happen. Futures you built out of fear, out of misread signals, out of the shaky ground of uncertain perception. And the worst part is, once the future arrives, once it confirms your fear, you think you were right all along. You believe you saw it coming. You never realize that your belief made it so. Your misunderstanding becomes a prophecy, not a warning, not a premonition, but a blueprint. And now think about your regrets. The things you did to prepare for pain that never came. The people you pushed away to protect yourself from a rejection that never happened. The moments you ruined by bracing for their collapse. You don't even realize how many of your so-called instincts were just mistranslations. The silence that made you panic wasn't cruelty, it was exhaustion. The message you took as indifference was sent in shame. The coldness you prepared for was confusion, not rejection. But you never asked. You didn't need to. Your mind had already answered. And so you acted, you changed, you pulled back. And the outcome matched what you feared. And now you call it foresight. But you never saw the future. You just misunderstood the present, and then lived accordingly. You might think this only happens occasionally, in moments of doubt. But what if it happens constantly? What if most of what you call intuition is just fear misinterpreting data? What if every step you take is built on something slightly wrong? What if you are always responding to a reality that isn't quite there? That would mean your life, the choices you make, the relationships you enter, the ones you leave, is shaped less by what is, and more by what you think is. And if your thoughts are wrong, then so is the life you think you're living. And the version of the future you're walking toward may not be fate, it may be a correction to a present that never needed fixing, a misunderstanding you're still trying to resolve, a solution to a problem that never existed, but it's too late, because now you're already living in it. What if the worst thing you ever did was nothing, not a lie, not a crime, not a betrayal, just silence, just looking away, just continuing, as if nothing was wrong. No blood on your hands, no obvious damage, and yet somehow you're still responsible, still guilty. You were there when it happened, not close enough to stop it directly, but close enough to know, close enough to understand what would follow. And still, you stood still. You said nothing. You watched. You waited. And eventually, you left. At the time, you told yourself it wasn't your place, that it wasn't your fault, that someone else should step in, someone better equipped, more qualified, more involved, but no one did. And so slowly, quietly, something terrible happened. And you did nothing to stop it. It wasn't your action that caused it, but it was your inaction that allowed it. And now you carry that weight, not because the world blames you, but because you know what you didn't do, what you refused to do, what you chose very carefully to ignore. And it's easy to ignore most of the time. The consequences aren't loud. They don't scream. They unfold quietly, in places just far enough away that you never have to see the damage fully. The person falls apart slowly. A life unravels out of sight. A disaster unfolds, not all at once, but piece by piece, while you keep living as though you saw nothing. You weren't the abuser. You weren't the liar. You weren't the one who pulled the trigger, or made the rule, or caused the loss. You just stood there, watching, or pretending not to watch. You think of yourself as good, kind, moral. But maybe goodness isn't about what you feel, it's about what you interrupt, what you prevent, what you refuse to let happen while you're standing there. And if you do nothing, maybe that silence makes you part of it. Maybe your presence, your quiet witnessing, is enough to stain you. It gets worse when you consider that maybe you knew this all along, that on some level you understood what your silence meant, that your heart tightened, your body tensed, your instincts screamed that something was wrong, and you smothered them. You chose not to act. You didn't want the confrontation. You didn't want to be blamed. You didn't want to get involved. You told yourself it wasn't your responsibility, but deep down, maybe you knew that was a lie. Maybe your desire to stay clean, to stay innocent, is what made you guilty. Because innocence isn't passive. It doesn't just mean you didn't do the wrong thing. Sometimes it means you actively did the right thing. And if you didn't, maybe innocence doesn't apply. And now you start to remember all the other times, small moments, simple choices, things you shrugged off, things you let slide. Times when someone needed you to speak, to step forward, to stand against something, and you didn't. At first, those moments seemed minor, forgettable, but they add up. Each one a quiet weight pressing down. And now they feel like a pattern, like a shadow you cast without realizing it. Like a kind of quiet complicity that follows you wherever you go. The guilt doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It waits. It surfaces in strange moments when someone tells a story and you remember your silence. When someone breaks down and you remember looking away. When someone asks for help and you remember all the times you didn't. And even now, you want to resist this. You want to tell yourself that guilt should belong to the person who acted. That moral responsibility needs a clear line, a direct cause. But life doesn't always work like that. Sometimes harm happens in the spaces where no one intervenes. Sometimes the worst damage happens in silence, in delay, in looking away. And maybe the most dangerous kind of guilt is the kind no one else sees, the kind no one accuses you of, the kind you live with alone, because no one else knows what you knew. No one else felt that moment the way you did. And so no one else can say, with certainty, that you failed. But you know. And once you see it, once you really understand what you didn't do, you can't unsee it. You realize that morality isn't only about the lines you refuse to cross. It's also about the lines you allow to be crossed when you stay quiet, when you walk away, when you protect your comfort more than someone else's survival. And the worst part is, the world won't punish you. It'll let you keep living, keep smiling, keep pretending nothing happened. But inside, that silence echoes. That guilt grows not for what you did, but for what you allowed, for what you refused to stop. Because sometimes doing nothing is the loudest betrayal of all. What if everything you believe about yourself is actually just what you've rejected? You say you're kind because you're not cruel. You call yourself honest because you feel disgust when you lie. You feel certain you're brave only because you've seen cowardice in others and felt distant from it. But what if these aren't definitions? What if they're boundaries? What if who you are isn't something solid inside you, but just a fragile outline shaped by everything you've refused to become? This is where it gets difficult. Because then the truth of who you are depends completely on what you see and reject. You're not generous, you just despise selfishness. You're not strong, you just fear weakness. You build a self not from what you are, but from what you distance yourself from. It's subtraction, constant, invisible. You become yourself by trimming away everything that isn't you. But that also means, if those things disappeared, would you still know who you are? If you'd never met cruelty, would you know that you're kind? If you'd never been tempted to lie, would honesty mean anything? If no one had ever tried to hurt you, would you still call yourself forgiving? You depend on contrast, on opposition. Every part of your identity leans on something else for definition. You know yourself only by the shadows you refuse to enter. That's what makes this thought so disturbing. Because it means your sense of self isn't whole or stable or even real. It's a constant negotiation, A performance, adjusted every day based on what's around you. If you changed your environment, would your identity change with it? If the people in your life vanished, if the rules of your world shifted, how much of you would still remain? You might want to say, the core of me would survive, the essential parts. But what if there is no core, just a series of responses, reactions to what you aren't? Every time you say, I would never do that, you believe it makes you stronger, clearer, more real. But all it's doing is placing another wall, narrowing the space you're allowed to exist in. And what happens when you run out of things to push against? Somewhere in the back of your mind, you've already felt this. The strange feeling of identity slipping when circumstances change. When you move cities, when a relationship ends, when your routine collapses. You think you've changed, but maybe you just lost the thing that shaped you. And now you're floating, undefined, waiting for something new to push against, so you can become yourself again. And now the more disturbing possibility appears. What if the people you hate are holding you together? What if your certainty that you are not them is the only reason you still feel like someone? The more you define yourself by opposition, the more you need the other side to stay intact. If they disappeared, your identity would crumble too. Because being the opposite of something only works as long as that something still exists. You're not building a self, you're outlining an absence. You say this is me, but what you really mean is this is what I'm not. Every choice, every opinion, every belief, reactive, defensive, temporary. A structure made of reflections, distortions, negations. You exist only in contrast. And this raises one final question, quiet but paralyzing. If you only know yourself through what you are not, then what happens if you ever find silence? Not just around you, but inside. Nothing to reject, no one to oppose, nothing pushing back, just stillness. What's left of you then? What if you're always right, but everyone stops listening? There's a moment, usually small, when you realize you've won the argument, but lost something else. The silence that follows isn't agreement, it's detachment, resignation, not because your logic failed, but because your presence now carries a weight no one wants to feel again. And maybe you don't notice it right away. Maybe it feels like victory, but slowly something begins to decay. You think you're defending truth. You believe that correcting others is noble, even necessary. You tell yourself it's not about ego. It's about clarity, about accuracy, about not letting falsehood stand unchallenged. But each time you win, the room changes. People pause before speaking. They rephrase, they withhold, and they begin to smile less. You say you want honesty, but you've made it dangerous. You say you welcome disagreement, but you crush it when it arrives. Not with anger, just certainty. Cold, exacting certainty. Until eventually, no one brings you disagreement at all, only silence, or avoidance, or polite nods that mean nothing. And maybe you notice, and maybe you don't. Maybe you just think people have become quieter, less engaged. But they haven't changed. You have. What you're hearing now is not deference. It's distance. It happens slowly. You argue well, make good points, back them up. But each correction, each small triumph, carries a hidden cost. You don't see it because it's invisible. No one tells you they feel small around you. No one says they choose comfort over honesty when they're with you. No one warns you that your need to be right has started pushing people away. You win the argument, but you lose the shared space where trust used to live. You become right, but alone. And maybe that feels unfair. You think, shouldn't the truth matter more than comfort? Shouldn't facts outweigh feelings? But truth doesn't live in a vacuum. It travels through people. And when the messenger wounds, the message doesn't survive. It becomes harder to tell what's actually true and what's just emotionally safe to say around you. Harder to know if people agree with your reasoning or if they've just learned to stop pushing back. You harder to recognize whether you've built respect or fear. You keep talking, but fewer people respond. You explain things, but fewer people care. You stay right. But the room grows colder, and sometimes someone braver will tell you the truth. That you're hard to be around, that your constant corrections feel suffocating, that conversations with you feel like walking into a trap. Not because you're cruel, but because you leave no room for others to be wrong safely. You begin to realize that being right all the time doesn't mean you're wise, it just means you're skilled at domination in disguise. You win, not with kindness, but with exhaustion. People stop fighting you, not because they've changed their minds, but because it's no longer worth the emotional cost. And then you find yourself in a strange position. You speak clearly, you reason well, but no one listens with care anymore. You're not persuasive, you're just accurate, and accuracy, without trust, turns cold. You may not notice until one day someone says something you know is wrong, and you stay silent. Not because you've changed your mind, but because you're tired. Or maybe because you finally see what all your correctness has created. An environment where people speak less, share less, hide more. And in that moment, you begin to understand something painful. That truth matters, but so does how it's delivered. That being right doesn't make you good. That you can win every argument and still lose the people who matter most. And maybe worst of all, you realize they were never trying to win. They were just trying to feel heard. But you turned every disagreement into a battlefield. And now they're gone. Not defeated, just gone. What if everything you experience, the color of the sky, the sound of your name, the taste of your favorite food, isn't real in the way you think it is? What if it's not just filtered or interpreted, but invented? And once your brain finishes inventing it, it erases the blueprint, deletes the footprints, hides the very fact that it was ever involved. You feel certain you know what's real. You trust your senses, your memories, your judgments. But all of it, the shape of a face, the feeling of regret, the passage of time, is created internally, stitched together moment by moment, based on incomplete signals and assumptions. And then it's presented to you as if it came from outside, untouched, objective, true. Your brain doesn't want you to see the edits. It wants you to believe in the final cut. It wants the illusion of raw, unfiltered perception, so it removes the scaffolding. It smooths over contradictions. It deletes the gaps. You don't see the guesses it made, the missing information it filled in, the emotional weighting it applied without your consent. You see the result, and you believe it. Not because it's accurate, but because it feels immediate. You think memory is a record. It's not. It's a reconstruction. Every time you remember something, you change it. Slightly, subtly, unconsciously. The act of remembering rewrites the memory, but your brain doesn't tell you that. It offers the new version with the same authority, with the same sense of certainty. As if it never changed, and it gets worse. Your brain doesn't just construct your reality, it edits out the parts that don't fit. When something doesn't align with your beliefs, your expectations, your narrative of who you are, it often disappears. You don't notice this. You can't. That's the point. The brain is protecting the illusion of coherence. You think you're seeing the world. You're not. You're seeing a world, one possible version, generated in real time, based on what your brain thinks will make sense. And it hides the fact that it made that decision. You might wonder why. Why create the illusion of truth and then hide the process? The answer is stability, control, efficiency. You can't function if you doubt every sensation, question every moment. So the brain silences the complexity. It wraps everything in a layer of certainty. But that certainty isn't a reflection of truth. It's a side effect of ignorance. The less you see of the process, the more convinced you are by the outcome. There's a name for this: confabulation. When your brain doesn't know something, it invents a story. It gives you a reason, a justification, an explanation, and then it makes you believe you always knew it. You didn't, but the false memory feels real, and you have no access to the moment it was created. And this doesn't just happen in rare extreme cases. It happens constantly. Your preferences, your opinions, your beliefs, they're often post-rationalized. You make a choice first, then your brain invents a story that makes that choice seem deliberate, logical, inevitable. Then it erases the moment of invention. It hides the evidence. You think your consciousness is in control, but consciousness is more like a press secretary. It doesn't make decisions. It just explains them after the fact, as convincingly as possible. And it doesn't know it's lying. There's no conspiracy here, no malevolence. Just a system trying to make sense of a chaotic world. A system trying to keep you moving forward, making decisions, feeling confident, because doubt is paralyzing. So it gives you certainty and takes away the tools you'd need to question it. But every so often, a crack forms. Something doesn't fit. A memory that feels wrong. A reaction you can't explain. A sudden sense that the world isn't quite as stable as it seems. And in those moments, you might glimpse the machinery, the edits, the gaps. You might realize that the thing you trust most, your sense of reality, isn't a window. It's a screen. And the image on that screen is being constructed, second by second, behind your back. And if you see that clearly, even once, it never fully goes away. You start to wonder how many of your thoughts were authored by you at all. How many of your memories are just stories? How much of your identity is scaffolding you were never meant to notice? Because the brain doesn't just create your world. It creates the illusion that it didn't. It builds reality and then buries the tools. And you're left walking through a dream, convinced it was always real. What if you're not actually guessing, but remembering? You're watching the roulette wheel spin. Red, black, red again. You feel the tension, the tilt of chance. The odds say it should be black next, but something in your chest tells you it's red. Not based on logic, not on strategy. Just a quiet, persistent certainty. You place the bet, the ball lands on red. Once could be luck, twice maybe. But what about the fifth time, the eighth? Each time you sense it, just before the result, you tell yourself it's coincidence, a fluke, but it keeps happening. Your guesses begin to feel more like recognition than chance, as if you aren't predicting at all. You're remembering a future that hasn't happened yet. You start to test it. Small things first. A coin flip. A card drawn from a deck. You write down your guess before you look. Over and over, you're right. Not always, but more often than you should be. More often than probability allows. You stop thinking of it as luck. You stop calling it random. The people around you notice. They ask how you're doing it. You don't have an answer. You say it's just a feeling. They think you're bluffing. You don't try to convince them. You're not even sure you want to understand it yourself. Because the more it works, the less it feels like something you control. It's not a power, it's a vulnerability. Like a thin crack in reality you can slip through, but only for a second, only when you're not trying too hard. And here's where it gets strange. The moment you try to explain it, even to yourself, it stops working. The guesses turn cold. The thread breaks. The sensation vanishes. And when you stop trying again, it returns. Subtle, quiet, like it needs you to stop believing before it can begin again. So you start to wonder, is randomness really random? Or is it just unreadable? Like a language too complex to decode with thought alone. A system that only reveals itself when you look without searching, feel without analyzing. You start to live differently. You stop overthinking decisions. You trust whatever answer arrives first before you can doubt it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But when it works in ways you can't explain. A left turn instead of a right, a missed train that leads to an encounter. A phrase you almost didn't say but did, and it changes everything. You stop using the word coincidence. It doesn't fit anymore. You stop asking what are the odds, because that question never helped. You begin to think the odds don't actually matter, that maybe there's no such thing as chance, only layers of cause and effect too deep for logic to reach. Then one night, you try something dangerous. You raise the stakes. You walk into a situation where being wrong has consequences, a test you shouldn't pass, a bluff you shouldn't survive, and it works again, exactly as you felt it would. You're not surprised, but you are scared, because now it's not just about luck. Now it's about trust, not in the world, but in yourself, in that quiet part of you that doesn't speak in words, the part that knows before knowing begins. But this kind of trust comes with a price. You stop trusting what others call reason. You question what you once thought was true. The rules begin to feel optional, not false, but incomplete. Like a game you've started to outgrow. You can't prove it, you don't try. But deep down, you begin to suspect that randomness is only random if you believe it is. And that belief, more than skill, more than chance, might be the only thing holding the illusion together. Because if randomness isn't real, then nothing is out of your control. And if everything is under your control, even just a little, then the scariest part isn't what's possible. It's what you might choose to do next. The door only closes when it's already too late to walk through it. Until then, you linger, hesitating, circling the decision, waiting for the pressure to mount, for the illusion of options to disappear. And when the door does finally slam shut, you call it fate. You call it inevitability. But it was always you, quietly, passively, letting every moment choose for you. Most people don't notice it while it's happening. They think they're deciding. They imagine they're in control. But most choices are never made when there are 10 paths laid out. They're made when only one is left standing. You say you're still thinking, still weighing your options, still not ready. But something deep inside you is stalling for time, not to decide, but to delay the collapse. Because once you choose, something dies. And so long as you haven't chosen, it still lives, at least a little. A dream, a possibility, an escape. That's the part no one likes to admit, how much of life is spent waiting until all but one path is gone. Not because you're weak, not because you're lazy, but because choosing feels like a kind of murder, a killing of all the other lives you won't get to live. So you tell yourself you'll decide tomorrow, after one more sign, one more conversation, one more sleepless night. And with each delay, the world quietly makes the decision for you. The job offer expires. The person stops waiting. The deadline passes. The silence grows louder, and then suddenly there's only one road left, and you take it, not proudly, not bravely, just quietly, with resignation, and you pretend it was your choice, because anything else feels like failure. But was it? What if, This is how choice actually works. Not a bold moment of clarity, but a slow erosion of possibility. Not a decision, but an acceptance. Not strength, but surrender. You weren't choosing between options. You were waiting for your fear to make the decision for you. You convince yourself you were being careful, thoughtful, strategic. But deep down, you were terrified of what would happen if you made the wrong choice. So you waited until wrong wasn't an option anymore. And then you stepped forward and called it the right one. People rarely choose their partner when many are available. They choose when they feel time is running out. They rarely choose a career when possibilities are wide open. They choose when money runs low or when rejections pile up. They rarely move to a new city when they're thriving. They move when something falls apart. It looks like courage. It feels like commitment. But most of the time, it's just collapse. You're standing where you are now, not because you chose it clearly, but because all the other options quietly slipped away. And that's the part that's hardest to face, because it means you might not be who you thought you were. Not bold, not decisive, just afraid of regret, afraid of missing out, afraid of getting it wrong. So you waited, and the world narrowed around you until only one answer remained. And that's what you called your decision. You never really knew what you wanted. You only knew what you were scared to lose. And when the fear of choosing something and regretting it outweighed the fear of having nothing left, you waited until the choice disappeared. Only then, finally, did you move. But not toward anything, just away from the silence. What if the thing you're most sure of, your identity, turns out to be the thing that makes truth feel wrong? Not because the truth is flawed, but because it forces you to become someone you're not ready to be. Think about a time you heard something that felt completely off, not because it was inaccurate, but because it didn't fit who you are. Maybe it was a fact, a claim, a perspective. Maybe it came from someone close, or maybe you stumbled on it alone. It landed like an attack, not on your logic, but on your sense of self. And something inside you pushed it away, not because it couldn't be true, but because if it were true, you'd have to change. You'd have to rethink things you've already decided. You'd have to question things you've already resolved. You'd have to become someone different. That's the part no one talks about. The emotional cost of truth. We think we reject lies because they're false, but often we reject truths because they ask too much of us, because they unravel the narrative we've built about ourselves. And the moment truth becomes a threat to that narrative, it stops feeling like truth. It just feels wrong. It feels hostile, disrespectful, even dangerous. People call this cognitive dissonance, but that makes it sound like a technical glitch. It isn't. It's a form of psychological survival. Because if the truth makes you wrong about something important, something you've used to define yourself, then it doesn't just challenge your ideas. It threatens your place in the world. It calls into question your memories, your values, even your goodness. That's when the walls go up. Not because you're stubborn or irrational or afraid of facts, but because accepting this truth would mean betraying the person you've believed yourself to be. And most people will do anything to avoid that betrayal, even if it means lying to themselves, even if it means living inside a version of reality that's carefully edited, not to deceive others, but to protect themselves from collapse. And the stronger your identity, the harder this becomes. If you define yourself by your beliefs, then every change feels like a death. If you see yourself as intelligent, then being wrong feels like humiliation. If you see yourself as kind, then facing harm you've caused feels unbearable. So you bend the facts. You doubt the source. You question the motive. Anything to keep the story intact. But that story is fragile, and the more you protect it, the more brittle it becomes. Until eventually, someone says something, asks a question, shows a contradiction, points out a gap, and suddenly it all cracks. And for a moment, there's panic. Not because you've heard something false, not because you've heard something false, but because you've heard something true that doesn't belong in the person you thought you were. And then you have a choice. You can reject it, blame them, distrust the feeling, or you can pause and ask what it would mean to let the truth in, fully, without filtering it to fit your old identity. That's the terrifying part, because letting it in means something has to die. Not literally, but emotionally. A belief, a role, a way of seeing yourself. Something you've leaned on for stability now has to be let go. And no one talks about how painful that is. How disorienting. How lonely. Especially when no one else sees it. When everyone around you still believes the version of you that you're starting to question. When the truth isolates you, instead of connecting you. And then it gets even harder. Because once you let in one truth, others follow. It's like pulling a thread. You can't stop with one. Each new realization shakes something loose. And soon you're not just rethinking one thing. You're rethinking everything. Your past, your intentions, your memories, your relationships. Your entire identity starts to shift. And it feels like you're falling, not into chaos, but into clarity. A clarity that hurts, because it shows you how much you've avoided, how much you've protected, how much of your identity was built on avoidance rather than honesty. And maybe the most disturbing part is this: the people who change the most aren't the ones who chase truth. They're the ones who survive it, who feel its weight, let it hit them, and sit in the discomfort long enough for it to reshape them. But there's no guarantee. Some people face truth and never recover. Some spend their lives fighting it, resenting it, fearing it. Others go numb, unable to tell anymore what's real and what's protective denial. Because once truth becomes dangerous to your identity, your instinct isn't curiosity, it's self-defense. And now you see the real paradox. The deeper the truth, the more it threatens your self-image. But the more you defend your self-image, the less truth you can bear. So you end up choosing between being whole and being honest, between protecting who you are and discovering who you could be. And the disturbing part is, most people will choose to be wrong if being right feels like self-destruction. Even if the lie costs them everything. Because in the end, the scariest part of truth isn't what it reveals. It's what it demands. You hold a belief so strongly that it defines you. You argue against it. You fight it. You shape your identity around opposing it. But over time, something strange begins to happen. Your language changes. Your posture shifts. Your reactions become predictable, patterned, almost rehearsed. You think you're resisting something external, but quietly, subtly, you're becoming more like it. You tell yourself you're different, that what you oppose disgusts you, but look at the way you talk about it. The time you give it, the thoughts you invest in dismantling it. Piece by piece, it begins to shape you. Your opposition becomes a mirror, and without noticing, you start to reflect what you claim to reject. It's easy to miss when it's happening. You start by mocking something. You analyze it, criticize it, point out its flaws, and slowly your own values shift, not toward something new, but toward a more sophisticated, masked version of what you hated. You begin using the same tactics, the same justifications, the same intensity. But this time, it's for your side, so it feels justified, even noble. You might tell yourself you're fighting for good, but listen to how your voice sounds when you're angry. Notice how your tone changes, how your certainty hardens. There's no space for doubt anymore, no openness, just a rigid conviction that you're right and they're wrong. It's not about truth. It's about defeating the thing you hate, and that need begins to consume everything else. This is how it starts, not with agreement, but with obsession. Not with admiration, but with fixation. You spend so much time in reaction to something that you lose the ability to think without it. You can't explain your beliefs without referencing theirs. You can't speak a sentence without framing it against them. You believe you're resisting corruption, but what if you're just imitating it more skillfully? You might think, I would never become what I despise. But how would you know if becoming it simply means copying its energy, its tone, its intensity, but redirecting it toward a different target? How can you be sure you haven't already crossed the line? Consider the way conflict shapes movements. At first, it's about opposition, resistance. But over time, the methods of power begin to leak in. Manipulation, suppression, fear, control. Not all at once, but quietly, incrementally. And no one notices because they still think they're fighting the same fight. You hold onto the label of opposition, like a shield. You say, I'm against this, while acting exactly like it. The hatred you feel becomes fuel, but that fuel burns the same way, no matter who holds the match. This isn't just about politics or ideology. It happens in relationships, in personal beliefs, in how we treat each other. Someone hurt you once, and now you're always on guard. But slowly, that caution turns to cruelty. You become cold, dismissive, paranoid. You think you're protecting yourself, but you're repeating the pattern, just from the other side. It's uncomfortable to admit that in trying so hard not to be something, we often end up becoming it in a different form. Because resistance can be a disguise for imitation, especially when it's emotional, especially when it's personal. Look closely at yourself, not your beliefs, but your reactions. What happens when you see the thing you hate? What happens inside your body, your mind, your tone? Are you calm? Are you rational? Or do you feel that same heat, that same disgust, that same certainty they feel? If you answer with anger, if you answer with contempt, if you answer with absolute conviction that your side is pure, then the transformation is already underway. You don't notice it happening because it doesn't feel like becoming the enemy. It feels like standing firm, like staying true. But identity built entirely on opposition has no foundation of its own. It just mirrors, reflects, and reaction becomes habit. Soon, there's no distinction between what you believe and what you're against. You're not standing apart, you're dancing in the same pattern, just on a different beat. And eventually, you forget why you started. The purpose fades, the values dissolve. All that's left is the fight itself. You wake up every day, fueled by the same thing you said you'd never become. The same rage, the same control, the same fear. You thought you were resisting. But all along, you were being shaped, molded, altered by your focus, your fixation, your refusal to look away. Because becoming something doesn't always start with agreement. Sometimes it starts with obsession. Sometimes it starts with hate. And by the time you notice the change, it's already too late to reverse it. Because by then, you've built your whole identity on being against something. And without it, you don't know who you are anymore. And that's when you become it. Completely, quietly. You see something, read something, hear something, and before you've had time to think, it feels true. Not because it's backed by data, not because it's proven, but because it matches the exact shape of what you're afraid of. A story about a virus being secretly manufactured. A headline about a political opponent plotting in the shadows. A study suggesting your worst belief about the world is correct. It doesn't matter how shaky the source is, how little evidence is behind it. If it confirms your fears, it gets through your defenses. It feels like truth. And once something feels like truth, it becomes very difficult to let go. It's not that you believe everything you see, it's that you believe what feels emotionally familiar. The frightening becomes convincing. The terrifying becomes persuasive. And even when you try to be rational, your thoughts quietly bend toward the conclusions you're already scared of. You notice it in little ways. You assume bad news means something is going wrong. You assume strange behavior means something dark is being hidden. You prepare for the worst, even when there's no reason to. It feels responsible, intelligent, careful. But what it actually is fear, looking for facts to support it. You think you're following logic, but you're actually tracing the shape of your own dread. And that makes you easy to manipulate, because anyone who understands your fears can guide what you believe. They don't have to prove anything, they just have to echo the right anxiety. And once that echo hits, your mind does the rest. You fill in gaps, ignore contradictions, invent patterns, all without realizing you're doing it. You believe the story because it makes you feel safe, not because it's true. Because if the world is dangerous in the way you expect, then at least it's predictable. At least your fears make sense. It's more comfortable to believe the danger is real than to believe you've been reacting to shadows. You'd rather be scared and right than calm and uncertain. So when someone shows you a fact that contradicts your fear, it doesn't feel like a correction. It feels like a threat. You don't see new information. You see someone trying to take away your preparation, trying to leave you exposed. You feel anger, not curiosity, defense, not openness, and that's how fear wins. It builds a self-sustaining world where every new fact is either proof or enemy. You become unable to change your mind, because changing your mind would feel like giving up your only defense. And you don't notice how much that changes you. You start ignoring hope, dismissing complexity. You stop being able to imagine good intentions in others. You start interpreting confusion as deception. You forget how to tell the difference between what's likely and what's merely scary. Fear doesn't just shape what you believe, it reshapes who you are while you're believing it. You become suspicious, rigid, isolated. You filter every conversation through danger. You become more certain, but less grounded. You gain clarity, but lose accuracy. Your world starts to shrink, becoming sharp-edged and full of traps. Everything means something. Everyone is hiding something. Nothing is safe unless you're in control. And maybe the most dangerous part is, it works. It protects you from surprises. It helps you avoid pain, but it also ensures you never see the world clearly again. You mistake your fear for insight. You mistake your suspicion for wisdom. You think you're seeing the truth, but you're just staring at a mirror, reflecting only the parts of reality that match your nightmares. Because the mind doesn't seek truth. It seeks certainty, and fear gives you certainty faster than anything else. So you latch onto the facts that hurt you most, because they explain why you're tense, why you're hypervigilant, why you feel like something's wrong, even when nothing is. Fear needs a reason, and any reason will do. And if someone tells you something comforting, something hopeful, something good, you don't trust it. You see it as naive or manipulative. You think it's too good to be true, because the idea that things might actually be okay feels more dangerous than believing they're about to collapse. You don't realize how much effort it takes to live this way. Constant scanning, constant doubt, constant stress. But fear never feels exhausting in the moment. It feels useful. It feels like survival. So you keep feeding it. You keep collecting the stories that scare you. You keep building your reality around the worst-case scenario. And little by little, that fear becomes your truth. Not because the facts support it, but because you've stopped believing any fact that doesn't. What if the only people you can truly trust are the ones who make you uneasy? Not the warm ones, not the charming ones, not the ones who make you feel safe, but the ones who look at you too long, the ones who ask questions no one else dares to ask, the ones who speak so plainly it feels like an attack. You pull back from them instinctively. But maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the signal. Because people who want something from you usually make you feel good. They smile at the right times. They agree with your opinions. They reassure you, flatter you, echo back what you already believe. It feels like trust, but it's not. It's seduction. You're not being seen, you're being managed. But someone who sees you clearly, who doesn't care if you like them, that's different. That's rare. And it's unsettling. They're not here to comfort you. They're here to tell you something you don't want to hear. Maybe they disagree. Maybe they challenge you. Maybe they don't even like you. But they're not hiding. They're not performing. They're being honest. And honesty is always a little frightening. The truth doesn't feel safe. It doesn't feel gentle. It disrupts. It exposes. It strips away the stories you tell about yourself. So the people who tell it, the people who refuse to protect you from it, will always feel like a threat. Not because they are dangerous, but because they're not playing the same game. And if you think back, really think back, the moments you've grown the most weren't the ones that felt good. They were the ones that hurt. The conversations that left you shaken. The people who pointed out what you were afraid to see. You didn't thank them at the time. You probably hated them for it. But later, when the dust settled, you saw it clearly. They were right, and they were the only ones who cared enough to be honest. Most people won't risk that. They want your approval. They want your affection. They want to stay on your good side. So they give you what you want. They keep things smooth. And you start to believe that trust means comfort. That the people who make you feel good are the ones who are safe. But that's not trust. That's anesthesia. It keeps you calm while the truth slips further away. The people who scare you just a little are the ones who might actually tell you the truth. Because they're not trying to be liked. They're not trying to be easy. They're not protecting your ego. They're showing up fully. And that's terrifying, because it forces you to do the same. But this creates a problem, because most of us spend our lives avoiding discomfort. We surround ourselves with people who confirm us, echo us, mirror us. It feels stable, it feels secure, but underneath there's rot, secrets, half-truths, conversations that never happen. We call it friendship, but it's just an agreement to avoid reality together. Real trust isn't about liking someone. It's about being willing to hear them, even when you don't like what they say. Especially then, it's about knowing they'll say it anyway. Not because they enjoy the discomfort, but because they care more about what's true than what's easy. That kind of person won't flatter you. They'll confront you. Not with cruelty, not to win, but because they can't bear to lie. They see the cost of silence, and they won't let you pay it. And maybe you've had someone like that before. Someone who said the thing no one else would say. Someone who made you feel small, exposed, embarrassed, but never humiliated. Someone who saw you struggling and didn't offer comfort, but clarity. You pushed them away. You told yourself they were harsh, unkind, too intense. But even now, years later, part of you knows they were the only one telling the truth. And you start to realize something. The people who scare you, the ones who make your stomach tighten just a little when they walk into the room, those might be the only people worth listening to. Not because they're always right, but because they're not invested in your illusions. They're not here to protect your self-image. They're here to protect something deeper. And yes, it's hard, because trust built on comfort feels better. It's warm, predictable. You always know where you stand, but it's also fragile. One disagreement, one difficult truth, and it crumbles, because it was never built to withstand anything real. But trust built on truth is different. It's uncomfortable. It's slow. It's earned in hard moments. But it lasts. It doesn't disappear when things get tense. It doesn't collapse when you make a mistake. It holds, even when it hurts. So the next time you feel that flicker of fear, the tightening in your chest, the impulse to avoid, the feeling that this person sees too much, don't walk away too quickly. Sit with it. Pay attention. Ask yourself, are you uncomfortable because they're dangerous or because they're honest? Because if it's the second one, that might be someone worth trusting. Even if they scare you, especially if they scare you. You think back to a time when something hurt. Not a physical injury, but a moment. A sentence, a silence. Something that cracked you open, just slightly, just enough to never fully close again. And without trying, without effort, that memory sharpens, clear, vivid, intact. Like it happened yesterday. But try now to remember a moment of perfect peace. A time when everything felt right. No fear, no stress, no threat, just quiet contentment. Try to picture it in the same way. Try to feel it clearly, and you can't. You might get fragments, a sunset, a laugh, a feeling that was close to safety, but it's blurry, faded, distant, like it belonged to someone else. The details don't stay. The feeling doesn't return. Not really. Pain stays. Peace doesn't. Your body remembers pain with precision. The tension in your shoulders. The drop in your stomach. The words you couldn't answer. You don't have to try. It arrives uninvited. Pain teaches. It burns itself into you. And even after it's over, your mind keeps revisiting it. Not out of choice, but instinct. As if remembering it will somehow protect you next time. But what does peace teach? You never study it. You never rehearse it. When it's gone, you don't relive it. You don't analyze what made it good. You just want it back. But you don't remember how it felt. Not in the way you remember fear, or loss, or shame. Even your language is shaped around it. You say you're haunted by pain, but never by peace. No one says a memory of calm keeps them awake at night. No one lies in the dark, replaying a moment of happiness so vividly it hurts. You do that with regret, with failure, with betrayal. And maybe that's why peace never lasts, because it doesn't get reinforced. It doesn't get repeated. It slips through, too soft to stick. Think of someone you lost, not just gone, but who left a mark. What do you remember first? Is it a warm moment, a smile, or is it the last thing they said, the way they left, the moment you realized they were gone? Your mind isn't cruel, it's just designed to protect you. And protection means remembering what hurt, so it can avoid it next time, even if there is no next time. And so pain becomes the blueprint. Even when you're safe, even when things are calm, you don't trust it. You wait, you brace. Your nervous system stays on alert because you've learned again and again that good things end, that calm doesn't last, that peace is fragile, and you don't want to be caught off guard again. So you prepare, always, even when you don't need to. But the cost of that preparation is this. You miss peace while it's happening. You don't feel it fully, because part of you is already anticipating its loss. And then, when it's gone, it doesn't imprint. It doesn't become memory. It becomes a vague sense that something was once okay. You don't relive peace, you grieve it. And the more pain you carry, the harder it is to feel safe at all. Not just emotionally, but physically. Your breath gets shallow, your body stays tense. You forget what it feels like to fully relax. Even when nothing's wrong, and then peace, when it comes, feels unfamiliar, suspicious, like something you can't trust, and so you keep rehearsing pain. Not to wallow in it, not because you want to, but because your mind believes it's necessary for survival, for control, for safety. But it isn't. It just becomes habit, a loop, a system that no longer serves its purpose, but still runs in the background, shaping everything you feel, everything you expect. And so peace never has a chance. Even when it arrives, it's already being measured against the pain that might follow. And so it's never really peace at all. Just a pause, a quiet moment inside a storm that you assume is still coming. And maybe that's the cruelest part. Not that peace is rare, but that when it's here, you can't feel it. You're too busy preparing for its end, too trained by memory to believe it's real, because pain taught you too well. And peace was too soft to remember. What if most of your thoughts aren't really thoughts at all? What if they're just loops, echoes of things you've heard, things you've read, things you've said before? Words that feel original only because you forgot where they came from. Beliefs that feel personal because you've repeated them so many times they've fused with your sense of self. You say you're thinking, but are you? Or are you just performing the shape of thought, moving through familiar grooves, drawing conclusions you've already drawn 100 times before? Every opinion you share, every argument you defend, every outrage you feel, it all arrives too quickly, too fluently, as if the thinking happened long ago and now you're just playing it back. You believe you're engaging with the world, wrestling with ideas, questioning assumptions. But listen closely, and most of what fills your mind is noise. Phrases you've absorbed from somewhere else, reactions you've rehearsed, patterns you've mistaken for insight. There's a strange comfort in this repetition. It feels like control, like certainty. You never have to sit in real doubt, because the loop fills the silence. It rushes in before the uncertainty can grow. It tells you what to believe, what to feel, who to blame. It gives you the illusion of clarity, without the discomfort of real thought. But what happens when the loop is wrong? What if you've been repeating an answer to a question you've never actually asked? What if the beliefs you defend so passionately were never truly yours to begin with? There's a reason the loop is hard to notice. It speaks in your voice. It mimics your reasoning. It cloaks itself in conviction. And because it's familiar, you trust it. You never pause to wonder, where did this thought come from? Who first gave it to me? Why do I feel the need to repeat it? Try it now. Think of something you believe strongly, something you'd argue for. Then ask yourself, when did I first start believing this? Who taught it to me? Can I trace it to a moment of clarity? Or has it always just been there? And if it's always just been there, how do you know it's true? Repetition isn't the same as truth. Familiarity isn't the same as certainty. Just because something echoes through your mind doesn't mean it came from within you. It might have started as someone else's idea. A parent, a teacher, a friend, a tweet. You repeated it once, then again, and eventually it settled, became automatic, became yours, or at least felt like it. This is how the loop survives. It hides in plain sight. It rewards speed over depth, agreement over inquiry. It makes thinking feel easy, and once it's there, it resists interruption. The moment a new idea tries to enter, the loop reacts, defensive, hostile, certain. Because to question the loop is to destabilize your own mind, To admit that your thoughts might not be thoughts at all, but recordings, scripts, defenses, masks. And here's the disturbing part. You might prefer it that way. Real thinking is slow. It's uncomfortable. It requires silence, uncertainty, patience. It often ends with no conclusion at all, no tidy answer, just more complexity, more tension, more unresolved doubt. And maybe that's why you cling to the loop. It gives you something thinking, can't, finality, closure, a feeling of being right. But what if being right isn't the goal? What if the real goal is to wake up, to notice the loop when it begins, to feel it spin up inside you, fast and eager, and choose not to follow it? That choice is small, invisible, but powerful. It's the moment you hesitate before answering, the pause before you defend, the breath before you explain. It's the space where real thinking starts, not with certainty, but with stillness. And in that stillness you might hear something unfamiliar, something quiet, something that doesn't fit the loop. A question you don't know how to answer, a doubt you can't shake, a truth that doesn't echo. That's the moment to listen. Because maybe your real thoughts, the ones that belong to you, don't shout. They whisper. They arrive slowly. They don't repeat. They interrupt. You notice a shape in the clouds. It looks familiar. A face, maybe. Or a symbol. You stare, certain it means something. But a moment later, it's gone. Dissolved. Replaced by something else. Still, the feeling lingers that it had meaning, that it was trying to tell you something. You didn't imagine it. It was there. You're sure of it. This is how the mind works. It finds order. It looks for patterns, and once it sees one, it doesn't let go easily, even when the pattern is broken, even when the truth is something else entirely. You don't need evidence. You just need repetition. That's why you remember coincidences and forget randomness. You notice when someone texts you right as you were thinking about them, but ignore the dozens of times it didn't happen. You make meaning from noise, and once that meaning exists, you believe it, you feel it, you trust it. Even when it lies to you, you believe people behave the way they do, for reasons that make sense, that personalities are stable, that your boss is always cold, that your friend is always kind. You form patterns, you rely on them. But people change, people contradict themselves. And still, you ignore the contradictions. You protect the pattern. You preserve the shape your mind already built, because it's safer that way. You think the world is predictable, that if you follow the right steps, you'll get the right result. That effort leads to reward. That kindness returns to you. That life can be understood if you look closely enough. But you've been wrong before, haven't you? You've done everything right and still failed. You've trusted someone deeply and they betrayed you. You felt certain and been completely misled. But still, you keep trying to connect the dots. Keep building maps that explain what you see, because uncertainty feels worse than a lie. And here's the part you don't want to admit. Sometimes the pattern is lying, and sometimes you know it. You notice the same thoughts coming back again and again. The belief that someone is angry at you, the fear that you're being watched, the suspicion that something bad is about to happen. You gather evidence, you collect signs, but deep down, you already believe it. The pattern isn't built from facts, it's built from feelings. The logic came second. You needed it to justify what you already felt. And that's the danger. The mind protects its patterns, even when they're false, even when they hurt you, because letting go would mean admitting you were wrong, that your judgments were flawed, that your understanding of the world or yourself or someone else was never real. And that's a kind of pain most people won't face. So they double down. They twist the facts. They reject anything that doesn't fit. They'd rather live inside a lie that feels consistent than confront a truth that tears the pattern apart. And maybe you do this too. Maybe you've decided that you're unlovable, or destined to fail, or smarter than everyone around you. And every moment after that becomes a filter. You ignore what doesn't fit. You obsess over what confirms it. You think you're being objective, but you're not. You're stuck in a story your mind refuses to delete. You think you're discovering the truth, but you're just deepening the illusion. And even when you realize this, when you catch yourself doing it, it doesn't stop. The pattern's too strong. You've invested too much. So you tell yourself the lie is harmless, that it's helping you, that it's better than the chaos that would come if you let it go. But it isn't harmless. The wrong pattern leads to the wrong conclusions, the wrong choices, the wrong people, the wrong life. You start to live inside something that only looks like the truth. And slowly, without noticing, the real world becomes invisible to you. You stop questioning. You stop adjusting. You live by rules that never work to begin with. And you wonder why everything keeps falling apart. You think patterns are safe, that they protect you. But they don't. Not always. Sometimes they blind you. Sometimes they trap you. And sometimes the only way to move forward is to destroy the pattern you've trusted the most. Even if it means losing the version of yourself that believed in it. What if you never actually became confident, just became better at pretending to be? It starts small. A smile held half a second longer. A voice steady when it doesn't want to be. A sentence delivered without hesitation, even though doubt claws at every word. It feels fake at first. You're aware of the performance. You're hyper-conscious of the act, but you do it anyway, because something in you knows that appearing confident is often enough. You walk into rooms pretending you belong. You talk like you're certain, even when you aren't. You laugh like you don't care. You answer questions like the answers were always obvious. And slowly, people respond. They listen, they follow, they trust what you say, believe what you show them, mirror the certainty you project. You watch it happen, over and over, not because you changed, but because they believed the version of you were pretending to be. And then something else happens, quietly, invisibly. You begin to believe it too. You stand differently. You speak without rehearsing. You stop scanning for approval. You stop apologizing before you begin. You forget to be afraid. Not always, but sometimes, and those moments grow until the version you were faking and the version you are start to blur. The line fades. The mask clings too closely to your skin. And eventually, you can't tell which came first, who you are or who you decided to act like. But there's something disturbing about that, isn't there? If confidence can be faked into existence, what else can? What parts of yourself feel real, but are just roles you've performed well enough, long enough that they became permanent? You start to wonder if anything you feel is authentic, or just deeply internalized performance. You start to see your whole life as a kind of rehearsal for a self, a personality curated through years of subtle performance. Reactions copied from people you admired, phrases borrowed from someone you feared, smiles that became habits until they felt like part of your face. So much of who you are might be nothing more than practiced behavior. Confidence, kindness, ambition, even love, not lies, but not truth either. Just repetitions, reinforcements, muscle memory for the soul. And then it becomes even stranger. You realize this isn't just your story. Everyone around you is doing the same thing. The one who's always in control. The one who never seems afraid. You start to see the cracks, the effort, the mimicry, the fear beneath the surface, hidden just as carefully as yours, and it hits you. Maybe no one is confident. Maybe everyone is faking. Maybe confidence doesn't exist at all. Not as a trait, but as a behavior, a strategy, an illusion we agree to believe in, as long as it's performed convincingly. And if that's true, then your confidence was never real. It was just accepted. And that might be all it takes. But now comes the part you don't want to admit. If you can build something so powerful through repetition, what does that say about the pain you've internalized the same way? What if your anxiety is just as rehearsed? What if your insecurity, your guilt, your shame are all things you've repeated to yourself for years until they felt like truth, until they felt like you? The harsh voice in your mind, the doubt before every decision, the habit of retreating, apologizing, hiding. You didn't choose them, but you've performed them so often, they feel natural, automatic, authentic. You've become fluent in your own destruction. And the worst part is, you trust that version of yourself more. You believe the insecurity. You believe the fear. You assume the mask of confidence is false, but the voice of doubt is real. You assume what lifts you is fake, and what breaks you is true. But what if you have it backwards? What if your confidence, even when it's manufactured, is more real than the fear? Because it's what you do, not what you feel. What if identity is less about what lives inside you and more about what you repeatedly choose to become? That thought should be freeing, but it isn't. It's terrifying, because it means you're responsible, not for what you feel, but for what you feed, for which version of yourself you practice more. It means there's no solid ground beneath you, just layers of behavior, performed, rewarded, repeated. You're not a fixed identity, you're a momentum. You're whatever you keep rehearsing, and maybe you don't want to hear that. Maybe it's easier to believe that who you are is fixed, inevitable, beyond your control, that your fear is too deep, that your limits are real, that confidence is something other people are born with. But you know the truth now. You can fake confidence so well, it becomes real. And that means nothing about you is safe from change. Nothing is safe from transformation. Not even the parts you thought were yours. Not even the fear you thought was permanent. Not even the story you tell yourself when no one's listening, especially not that one. You're staring at the ceiling again, trying to force a solution to something that won't budge. The more you think, the worse it gets. You've gone over it 100 times, every angle, every variable, every possible outcome. But the problem remains exactly where you left it. Unsolved, tangled, resisting every attempt to be fixed. And then one day, it happens. You're not thinking about it anymore. Maybe you're walking home, doing dishes, drifting off to sleep, and suddenly it just appears. The answer, clear, simple, effortless. It arrives without warning, as if it had been waiting just outside your reach all along. You try to remember what triggered it, but there's no traceable path, no conscious process, just silence, then clarity. Like the solution came from someone else entirely. So you start to wonder what actually solved the problem. Was it your thinking, your logic, your relentless focus, or was it the exact moment you stopped trying? We tell ourselves that effort solves problems, that solutions come from attention, discipline, persistence. But what if that's only true up to a point? What if the key to solving some problems is to forget them, not give up on them? Not abandon them completely. Just let go. Stop clutching so tightly. Stop demanding resolution on your timeline. What if forgetting is part of thinking? Because there's a kind of forgetting that isn't the absence of thought. It's a different kind of thought. Quiet, background. Not linear, not conscious. Your mind still works on the problem, It just stops telling you it's doing it. And maybe that's what allows it to see things differently. Without the pressure, without the self-judgment, without the constant noise of trying to get it right. But this raises a strange possibility. If you solve problems better by forgetting them, what does that say about thinking itself, about control, about consciousness? It suggests that the part of you that solves problems might not be the part that worries about them. That solutions come not from who you are when you're focused and determined, but from who you are when you're relaxed, distracted, maybe even asleep. That the most useful part of your mind might be the part you don't control. The part that works silently in the background, unobserved, which means every time you force yourself to think harder, focus more, try again, you might actually be pushing the solution further away, drowning it in noise, trapping it under pressure. And the only way to get closer is to stop. But letting go doesn't feel responsible. It feels lazy, defeatist, wrong. We're taught to value effort, to believe that harder work leads to better outcomes, that if we're stuck, it's because we're not trying hard enough. So we tighten our grip, reread the problem, rehearse the facts, but nothing changes, nothing moves. And then eventually we walk away, not because we solved it, but because we're exhausted, frustrated, numb. And that's when the mind finally gets space to breathe. That's when it stops being watched. And that's when the answer arrives, quietly, indirectly, almost as an afterthought. So maybe forgetting isn't failure. Maybe it's not giving up. Maybe it's part of the solution. But here's where things get even more uncomfortable. If forgetting helps us solve problems better than thinking about them, then how many problems in your life right now are being made worse by your effort to solve them? How many arguments are you rehearsing, mentally defending yourself in conversations that haven't happened? How many decisions are paralyzed because you're afraid to make the wrong one? How many questions do you keep turning over, again and again, hoping that one more thought will make it all make sense? And what if every time you think about those problems, you're not solving them, you're making them worse, deeper, heavier, more stuck? What if the most intelligent response is to forget, to stop thinking? Not because you don't care, but because you care enough to stop damaging it. Now the contradiction gets sharper. You want control, you want to understand, but control might be the very thing preventing resolution. Understanding might only come when you stop trying to force it. And now you're faced with a problem logic can't fix. Because the moment you try to forget something on purpose, you're thinking about it again. You've made forgetting into a strategy, a task, a trick. But real forgetting isn't chosen. It just happens. It creeps in when you're not paying attention. It appears in the absence of effort, not as the result of it. So what do you do? How do you let go of a problem without trying to let go? How do you release something when the act of release becomes another form of control? Maybe you can't. Maybe that's the whole point. Maybe the only real way to solve some problems is to live with them long enough that they stop feeling like problems at all. And when that happens, the solution doesn't fix anything. It just changes how you see it. The problem was never solved. It just stopped needing to be. Because something in you shifted, quietly, without trying. And now you realize the disturbing part. Maybe forgetting isn't what solves the problem. Maybe it is the solution. What if the harder you try to understand, the further you drift from truth? You keep pushing, straining to grasp, to define, to figure out what's real, what matters, what it all means. You watch your thoughts, measure your beliefs, analyze your doubts. You dissect every moment for clarity, hoping that just one more insight will settle the chaos. But it doesn't. The more you look, the more it slips away. Maybe you've noticed this already. How trying to see clearly often just tightens the confusion. You latch onto an answer, and it calms you for a while. Then a crack forms, a doubt slips in, a contradiction, and suddenly the clarity is gone, replaced by something quieter, more unsettling. And so you try again. You try harder, you go deeper. But the clarity never holds. Every new insight comes with new uncertainty. Every perspective reveals its own blind spot. And the more complex the world becomes, the more you cling to whatever certainty you can find, even when it stops making sense. But what if the problem isn't that you don't understand enough? What if the problem is that you're trying at all? There's something strange about the mind. The tighter it grips, the less it feels, the more it scans and analyzes and questions, the more it dulls the very thing it's chasing. Like a mirror trying to reflect itself, or a hand trying to grab its own shadow. And this isn't just philosophical, it shows up in the smallest moments. When you're trying to remember a name that's on the tip of your tongue, it never comes. But when you stop searching, it drifts back on its own. When you're obsessing over whether someone likes you, every gesture feels like a code to decode. But once you stop needing to know, their behavior becomes clear. When you're terrified of being anxious, every heartbeat becomes a threat. But when you let the fear be there, just let it sit unexamined, it fades. There's a kind of clarity that only appears when you stop chasing it. But stopping feels wrong. Stopping feels like giving up, like surrendering to confusion, to chaos, to ignorance. You're told to be curious, to seek, to ask questions, to keep looking. But maybe you're not really looking for truth. Maybe you're looking for control. You want answers so you can predict, so you can manage, so you can avoid pain. But real clarity doesn't protect you from pain. It just lets you see it, sit with it, be changed by it. And that kind of clarity doesn't come from thinking more, it comes from thinking less. Not by turning off your brain, but by noticing when thought becomes noise, when the search becomes a distraction, when your need to understand becomes another form of denial. This is what people mean when they talk about letting go. It's not mystical or vague. It's the quiet decision to stop trying to fix every feeling, to stop naming every experience, to stop fighting the way things are. It's choosing to sit still in the storm instead of trying to explain the wind. And when you do that, something shifts. You stop asking whether things are good or bad, right or wrong, fair or unfair. You stop needing to define everything. You just see, not see as in analyze, not see as in explain, just see. And in that stillness, something becomes clear, not in your thoughts, but in your body, your breath, the air around you. A clarity beyond language, beyond understanding. But the moment you notice it, the moment you try to grab it, it's gone again. Because the clarity was never something you could hold. It was never something you could understand. It was only ever there when you stopped needing to. And now you're left with this. The realization that seeing clearly isn't about trying harder. It's about stepping back, watching, letting things be strange, letting yourself not know, not forever. Just long enough to remember what it feels like not to fight. And that's when you finally see, not because you figured it out, but because you stopped needing to. What if your mind isn't the best tool for making decisions? Not when it's working exactly as designed, but when it's trying too hard. When it's overanalyzing, calculating, rehearsing endless outcomes like a machine spinning itself into paralysis. What if the more you think, the less you know? There are moments where logic breaks down, not because the problem is too complex, but because logic starts to pull you away from something essential, something visceral, intuitive, human. You felt it before, that quiet certainty that arrives before your reasons do. The decision you made before you explained it to yourself. The yes or the no that just felt right. And then you started explaining it, justifying it, building a wall of reasoning to surround a decision that didn't come from reason at all. And the more you talked, the more confused you became. You started to doubt your instincts. You looked for data, evidence, arguments. You built logic on top of logic until the ground beneath it disappeared. We like to believe logic leads us somewhere pure, clear, objective. But logic is built on premises, assumptions, beliefs you already hold, whether you admit it or not. The more you trust logic, the more you trust the invisible framework beneath it. And that framework is often shaped by fear, fear of regret, fear of being wrong, fear of what others might think. Logic becomes a shield, not from ignorance, but from emotion, from the discomfort of trusting yourself. You've been in situations where everything pointed to one choice, where every rational step led to a single obvious path, and still something in you refused. Not because it didn't make sense, but because it felt wrong. Maybe you've walked away from a relationship that on paper seemed perfect, or turned down a job that offered everything you thought you wanted. You couldn't explain it at the time. People asked you why, and you struggled to answer. You mumbled something vague, said it wasn't the right fit. But the truth is, no argument could have captured what you felt in your body. A quiet refusal that didn't need words. And later, when you looked back, you realized that moment was right. That logic had led you to the edge of something false, that if you'd followed it, you would have betrayed yourself. There's a reason people say to go with your gut, but it's not magic, it's not mysterious. Your gut is just another form of intelligence, one that stores years of experience, pattern recognition, unspoken knowledge about the world and your place in it. It's not irrational, it's pre-rational, faster than thought, deeper than words. But we're taught to mistrust it, to override it with reason, to believe that emotion clouds judgment, that intuition is unreliable, that the only real truth is the one you can defend with arguments. And so, we learn to ignore ourselves. We build models, spreadsheets, pros and cons lists. We treat life like a math problem, and sometimes it works. But other times, we wake up years later in a life that feels wrong in a way we can't explain. We followed the logic. We did everything right. And still, something feels off, because logic can't see the full picture. It can't measure meaning, or joy, or regret. It doesn't know what matters to you. Not really. It can only work with what you feed it, and often you're feeding it the wrong questions. Sometimes, the most rational thing to do is to abandon reason entirely, not because logic is useless, but because it has limits. And when you reach those limits, trying to think your way through them only makes things worse. There's a point where more analysis doesn't bring clarity, it brings confusion, where the desire to be right becomes a fear of being wrong, where certainty turns into obsession. And in those moments, the best decision you can make is the one you can't explain. You feel the pull, you move towards something. You don't know why, but it feels like the truth. And maybe you'll never find the words to justify it. Maybe people will question you. Maybe you'll question yourself. But if you wait long enough, if you pay attention, you'll see what emerges from that choice. Not a perfect outcome, not a flawless result, but a quiet recognition that you acted from something real, something that belongs to you. And maybe that's what matters most. Not whether the decision was logical, but whether it was honest, whether it came from the part of you that isn't trying to be right or safe or good, but just trying to be whole. Because logic can't tell you who you are, but the way you choose when no one's watching, when there's no clear answer, no perfect path, no guarantee, that's when you find out. That's when you see yourself. Who are you when no one's looking? It's a question people ask to test your integrity. The idea is that your true self is what you do in the dark, when no one will ever know. That's supposed to be comforting, reassuring. But what if it's wrong? What if the real you doesn't live in privacy, but in performance? Think about how your posture changes when someone walks into the room, how your tone shifts mid-sentence, how the same joke feels different when it's said to an empty wall versus a room full of people. You don't just act differently when you're being watched. You become different, more deliberate, more careful, sometimes more honest, sometimes more false, but always more. And here's the strange part, that difference doesn't feel fake. It feels like you, like something sharper, more focused, more alive. Like your reflection in a mirror after too much silence, suddenly vivid, suddenly specific. When you're observed, something tightens. You become real. Why is that? Maybe it's because you want to be understood. Maybe it's because you're afraid of being misunderstood. Or maybe it's because the gaze of another person gives shape to what you otherwise ignore. Your words matter more. Your actions become decisions. Your face becomes a mask, but also a signal. You see yourself more clearly when someone else is watching. In private, you're loose, undisciplined. Your thoughts unravel. You drift into habits without noticing. You disappear into yourself. But in front of others, even one person, you return. You gather your pieces. You hold yourself in place. You become whole again, if only briefly, if only imperfectly. You might think this is inauthentic. That being watched forces you to pretend. But what if the opposite is true? What if pretending is what you do when you're alone, when there's no one there to contradict you? What if solitude makes it easier to lie to yourself, to shrink, to avoid the parts of you that want to be known? There's something terrifying in that idea, that the self you think is real might just be the self no one else ever sees. A version without boundaries, without mirrors, soft, slippery, unverifiable, and the self you show to others, the one you perform, isn't false. It's curated, yes. But it's also clarified, distilled. Not the whole truth, but a version of truth strong enough to survive contact. You don't just behave when you're watched. You believe differently. You feel differently. You carry your body differently. And over time, those differences don't fade when the audience leaves. They linger. They shape you. They bleed into your solitude, coloring how you think, how you speak, even when no one's there to hear you. So maybe the self that emerges under observation isn't just an act. Maybe it's a construction, a structure built to withstand the judgment of others. And maybe you need that structure more than you realize. Because the opposite is emptiness. The freedom to do anything, say anything, be anything, without consequence, without feedback, without shape. What is a self without shape? People talk about privacy, like it's sacred. A place where the real you can exist, unfiltered, untouched. But maybe the real you only takes form under pressure. Maybe you need the eyes of others, not to perform for them, but to become legible to yourself. It's not about approval or shame, it's about definition. You can't see yourself directly, only through reflections, only through others. And when you're being watched, those reflections multiply. You see yourself from angles you'd never imagine. You adapt. You evolve. You become someone. Not everyone, not everything, but someone. And maybe that's what frightens you the most, because it means you're not whole by yourself. You're not real in isolation. You need the gaze of another to become stable, to feel complete. You become most yourself in the moment you're most seen. And when no one's looking, you vanish. Not completely, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, bit by bit, until you're just a shadow, waiting for the light to return. You think your thoughts are hidden, that as long as you don't speak them, they're safe. But what if they aren't? What if your silence is loud in ways you can't hear? What if your body is saying things your mind desperately wants to keep secret? You enter a room and smile at someone you don't like. Your words are polite, your tone is even, but your shoulders stiffen, your eyes look just a second too long, or not long enough. You say nothing wrong, but the room feels colder after you arrive. You didn't speak your resentment, but somehow everyone knows. You want to believe you're composed, careful, controlled, but people read you all the time, whether they mean to or not, and not just in moments of anger or fear. They see the subtle tension in your face when someone else gets praised. They hear the sharp pause before your congratulations. They feel the forced laughter that trails a joke you didn't find funny. You might think you're hiding well, that what you think stays locked away, but your body betrays you constantly. Tiny hesitations, slight delays, brief flashes of discomfort. They leak out before your conscious mind can catch them. And most of the time, you're not even aware it's happening. You notice it in others too. You know when someone's lying, even if you can't explain how. You sense when someone dislikes you. Even when their words are kind, you pick up on things they never say, because their bodies don't lie the way their words do. And if you can feel it, so can they. Every opinion you have, every judgment, desire, fear, some part of it escapes. You might never say, "I'm better than you," but you glance past someone when they speak. You don't ask them questions. You don't wait for their reply. And they know, without knowing why, that they don't matter to you. The thought stays in your head. The belief remains unspoken, but the message still lands. You can deny it. Tell yourself that thoughts aren't actions, that what you think in private doesn't hurt anyone, but it does, because your thoughts shape your behavior in ways you can't fully control. Your tone, your posture, your choices. You think they're separate, but they aren't. You avoid people you find boring. You interrupt people you consider stupid. You dismiss ideas that come from someone you quietly think is beneath you. You believe your thoughts are hidden, but they're not. They show up in everything you do. And what's worse is that even when you try to fake it, people still feel the lie. You smile too wide. Your compliments feel hollow. Your kindness has the shape of obligation, not sincerity. You can't fake belief, not for long. Your behavior always tells the truth, eventually. This is the trap. You can control what you say, but not always what you show. You can censor your voice, but not your instincts. And your instincts are always responding to your thoughts. No matter how small, no matter how fleeting, you meet someone you envy. You act friendly. You compliment their success. But you interrupt when they talk about it. You downplay their achievements in subtle ways. You don't mean to. You're just reacting. But those reactions come from somewhere real. Somewhere inside you that you can't completely mask. You can convince yourself that you're being neutral, that you're not judging, that your inner world is private, sealed off, protected. But everything you do is colored by what's happening in your head. Every conversation, every silence, every glance, every pause. You think you're safe because you didn't say the thing. But the way you stand, the way you nod, the way your attention flickers, it all speaks. and the people around you are listening, even when they don't realize it. Your discomfort when someone tells the truth, your eagerness to change the subject, your sudden quiet when a topic hits too close. These aren't random, they're patterns. And even if no one can name them, they feel them, they see them. And over time, they begin to know things about you that you never intended to share. Because behavior is memory, and memory is recognition, people begin to associate you with certain feelings. Not because of what you've said, but because of how you made them feel when you said nothing at all. You think your inner world is yours, that what happens in your head doesn't belong to anyone else. But your actions borrow from it constantly. Your hands move when your mind is restless. Your voice shifts when your thoughts change. Your presence becomes heavy when your heart is full of things you refuse to admit. This isn't about being dishonest. It's about the limits of control, about the quiet failure of secrecy. You can believe something horrible and never speak it, but the people you're thinking it about might feel it anyway, and they'll carry that feeling, even if they never know exactly where it came from. You might never be accused, never be confronted, but you'll notice something over time. People pull away from you without explanation. Relationships cool, conversations get shorter, trust evaporates quietly, and you'll wonder what happened. You'll tell yourself you were careful, that you never said anything wrong, but you won't see that your thoughts said it all for you. You'll keep insisting that you're misunderstood, that people judged you unfairly, that no one really knows who you are. But maybe they do. Maybe they always did. And maybe the truth you thought you were hiding was never hidden at all, just quietly obvious to everyone but you. What if the only way to feel infinite is to know you aren't? You probably think that freedom comes from having no restrictions, no ceilings, no rules, that infinity is the ability to go anywhere, do anything, become everything. But try to picture it. A world where nothing limits you. No deadlines, no expectations, no gravity pulling you back to earth. Just endless possibility, all the time. It sounds beautiful. But would it be? You wake up. You don't need to work. You don't need to sleep. You don't need to eat or choose or move. You can do anything at any time, forever. But what do you do? What do you care about when nothing matters, when nothing ends, when there is no edge to press against? You may think that would feel like freedom, but freedom from everything eventually becomes freedom from meaning. When there's nothing you have to do, nothing feels worth doing. The excitement of possibility disappears. When possibility is endless, and you stop feeling infinite because you can't feel anything at all. You see, infinity doesn't feel infinite unless it's measured against something. And the only way to measure something is with limits. A candle seems bright because it flickers in the dark. A moment feels long because it ends. A life feels meaningful because it's short. You don't appreciate motion unless you've been still. You don't understand joy unless you've known pain. You don't grasp how vast the sky is until you hit the fence at the edge of a field. Without contrast, everything flattens. The highs disappear because there are no lows. The choices feel hollow because they cost nothing. When every door is open, none of them matter. There's no reason to walk through one instead of another, because wherever you go, it's the same, more endlessness, more freedom, more weightlessness. And that weightlessness becomes unbearable. We crave boundaries, not because they limit us, but because they give shape to the chaos. A rule isn't a prison, it's a reference point. A consequence isn't punishment, it's proof that your actions mean something. And limits aren't walls, they're edges you can push against. Without them, you aren't free, you're lost. Think about a game with no rules. a story with no conflict, a person who lives forever and remembers everything and fears nothing. At first, it sounds ideal, but the more you imagine it, the more it starts to feel hollow. When there's no risk, there's no reward. When there's no scarcity, there's no value. When you can't fail, you can't succeed. Even pleasure requires limits. If you could feel bliss forever, you'd stop noticing it. Joy only feels like joy because it's rare, because it doesn't last. If you stretch it endlessly, it turns into numbness. Even happiness needs contrast. Even peace needs noise. And yet, we chase limitlessness. We dream of it. We call it success, ambition, power. We try to escape boundaries instead of understanding them. But the things that make life rich are never infinite. They're always constrained. A great conversation ends. A perfect night slips away. A beautiful song fades out. And that's what makes them precious. That's what makes you want to hold on to them, remember them, protect them. Their limit is what gives them shape. Without limits, nothing stands out. Without resistance, you have no momentum. Without loss, there's no love. You only feel infinite when you brush up against the edge of your ability, your time, your strength, and push just a little further. That's when you feel it. That expansion. That weight, that brief moment of knowing you've gone as far as you can, and maybe further. You need struggle to feel growth. You need boundaries to feel freedom. You need endings to feel depth. And you need limits to feel infinite. Otherwise, all you're left with is the endless horizon. Flat, quiet, empty, forever. Are you sure you're unbiased? Not just fair, not just reasonable, but truly objective. Because the moment you believe you are, you're not. It happens quietly. You form a strong opinion. You feel clear-headed, rational, maybe even enlightened. You think you've risen above emotion, above bias, above the flawed thinking of other people. You start seeing yourself as different, someone who sees things clearly, without distortion. But that's exactly when the distortion begins. Because the more convinced you are that your view is objective, the less likely you are to question it. And once you stop questioning your thoughts, your mind stops checking for error. You start filtering evidence, even if you don't mean to. You start noticing things that confirm your belief and ignoring things that threaten it. Slowly, you become blind to your own blindness. This isn't arrogance. It's a kind of unconscious trap, one you don't notice until you're already inside. Think of the last time you debated someone. Maybe you were calm. Maybe you stayed respectful. But inside, you already believed you were the one being fair. You believed they were the one being emotional, irrational, influenced. So you listened, but only to find flaws. You let them speak, but only so you could respond. You didn't engage to understand. You engaged to win, and yet, through it all, you still believed you were being objective. That's the paradox. Objectivity feels like a place you can reach, a mental high ground you can climb to. But it's not. It's more like a moving target. And the moment you claim to have it, you've already missed. Because true objectivity requires constant effort, constant self-doubt, constant humility. The belief that you might be wrong is the only thing keeping you honest. And the moment you lose that belief, even for a second, you become something else. You become rigid, defensive, fragile. You start protecting your ideas instead of testing them. You avoid information that makes you uncomfortable. You tell yourself the problem is other people, their ignorance, their blind spots, their echo chambers. You see yourself as the exception. But that's the most dangerous bias of all, the belief that you're the one person without bias. And the more intelligent you are, the worse it gets. Because intelligence gives you better tools to defend your beliefs, to rationalize, to construct arguments that sound airtight, even to yourself. You become better at lying to yourself without realizing it. And then slowly, your mind starts to close. Not loudly, not all at once, quietly, subtly, almost invisibly. You stop noticing nuance. You stop being curious. You stop changing. And the worst part is, you'll feel more confident than ever. Because confidence doesn't come from being right. It comes from not questioning. That's why the most biased people often sound the most certain. They aren't wrestling with doubt. They aren't searching for better understanding. They're done, settled, finished thinking. And maybe that's the scariest part. Bias doesn't feel like bias. It feels like clarity. It feels like finally seeing the truth. It feels like waking up. But maybe what you've really done is stopped waking up at all. Because once you believe your view is clear, once you believe your mind is clean, you lose the ability to see where it isn't. You lose the ability to reflect. You become blind, not just to your mistakes, but to the fact that mistakes are possible. So maybe the question isn't, am I biased? Maybe the question is where, because you are. Everyone is. It's not a flaw, it's a condition of being human. The only way to get closer to objectivity is to never believe you've reached it. The moment you think you have, it slips away. And that's what makes this so difficult. The pursuit of truth requires doubt. But doubt feels weak. Doubt feels like failure, like uncertainty, like vulnerability. So most people choose certainty instead. They choose the comfort of being right, the illusion of objectivity, and slowly they become trapped inside it, convinced they see clearly, unaware that they've already gone blind. And now you're left with a quiet, uncomfortable question. Not whether your beliefs are wrong, but whether you've already stopped looking. What if you couldn't bear the truth? Not because it's too complex, but because it's too simple. Not dramatic, not grand, just sharp, quiet, undeniable. A truth that strips away every excuse you've ever used to protect yourself. You think you want to know what's real. You think you're ready to face it. That truth is inherently better than deception. But that's not how your mind works. That's not how anyone's does. You don't process truth directly. You filter it. You bend it. You wrap it in just enough comfort so it doesn't burn when it touches you. You need lies, not the kind that mislead, but the kind that soften, the kind that make truth bearable. Every core belief you hold, every value, every principle, chances are it started as a lie, a softened version of something much colder, much harder to accept. You tell yourself people are good, that justice exists, that things happen for a reason, not because those things are true, but because you can't stand the world without them. You create these buffers without realizing. Stories, ideals, narratives. You tell yourself you're in control, that your choices matter, that your life has purpose. You shape random events into meaning because the alternative, that none of it means anything, is intolerable. And then, one day, something slips through. A moment, a realization, a crack in the structure you've built. Maybe it's small, a contradiction you can't explain. A doubt you can't shake. It lands in your mind and doesn't leave. And for a second, the full truth flickers into view. You feel the ground shift. The narrative falters. The protective lie begins to unravel. And you realize you're not ready. You never were. So you reach for something to cover it again. A new belief. A new explanation. You reframe the moment. You revise the memory. You lie to yourself, just enough to feel stable again. Because truth without a buffer is brutal. It doesn't care how it makes you feel. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It simply is. And most of the time, you're not strong enough to take it whole. Consider grief. You tell yourself they're in a better place, that it was meant to be, that they knew they were loved. These are not truths. They're small, beautiful lies that hold you together when everything else falls apart. Without them, you wouldn't survive the pain. Or think about justice. You believe that evil is punished, that good prevails, that fairness exists. But look closely, and you'll see how often injustice wins. How often cruelty thrives. You look away, not because you don't see it, but because accepting it fully would corrode something vital inside you. Even your own past is filtered. You reshape your memories to fit the story you want to believe about yourself. You remember your intentions, not your actions. You highlight the moments that fit your identity, and you blur the ones that don't. You lie to preserve the illusion of who you are. But here's the deeper problem. Even when you know you're lying, part of you still believes it. The lie becomes real through repetition, through comfort, through need. You stop distinguishing between the lie and the truth it covers, because over time they fuse. And when someone challenges that lie, when someone speaks the truth too plainly, you don't feel enlightened, exposed, but unstable, because they're not just undermining a belief, they're removing a structure that holds your mind together. This isn't weakness, it's adaptation. If you had to experience the full truth of existence, its randomness, its cruelty, its indifference, you would collapse. So you build systems, you create order. You lie just enough to keep going. And even when you seek truth, really seek it, you do so through layers. One piece at a time, one tolerance increase at a time. You can't jump to the core. You have to spiral in gently, protectively, like walking into freezing water inch by inch, because diving would kill you. You believe in progress, in healing, in redemption, not because these are facts, but because they give structure to pain. Without them, pain would just be pain, arbitrary, endless. You'd have no reason to endure it. So you frame your suffering. You say it's part of something larger. You say it will make you stronger, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it just breaks you, and you pretend it didn't. Maybe that's the hardest truth of all, that the lies you tell yourself aren't mistakes, they're necessary. That without them, you wouldn't make it through. But maybe, just maybe, the full truth is something you were never meant to hold in your hands. Only glance at, only feel at the edges, before pulling back, quietly, carefully, before it takes everything else with it. You're not choosing what to do, you're following what feels right. But how do you know the difference? That's the question. You make a decision, feel a sense of relief or confidence afterward, and assume it was your choice, your freedom, your will. But maybe you didn't choose at all. Maybe you reacted. Habitually, automatically. Maybe the thing you thought was freedom was just something you've done so many times you forgot to question it. You wake up at the same time each day, eat the same food, speak the same words, follow the same patterns. You think you're choosing, but you're repeating. And the more you repeat, the more invisible the pattern becomes, until it feels like who you are, until questioning it no longer occurs to you. That's the trap. Not that you're being controlled, but that you've trained yourself not to notice. You say yes when you're expected to. You smile when someone looks at you. You reach for your phone, not because you want to, but because the moment felt empty, and emptiness is unfamiliar. So you fill it, automatically, not because you're choosing, but because you're escaping. Even your values, what you think is right or wrong, could just be habits of thought, learned through repetition, reinforced through approval, protected by fear. You hold certain beliefs not because you've examined them, but because letting them go would make you feel unsafe, exposed, unanchored. So you protect them, not by reason, but by instinct, because they've become a part of your identity. A structure so old you can't tell where it came from. You defend it like it's yours, but maybe it was never really chosen. Maybe it was just inherited, practiced, rehearsed. And now, when you make a decision, you call it freedom. But how would you know? If all your choices are shaped by patterns you no longer see, what does freedom even mean? Think of the last time you tried to change something. Not something small, but something deeply wired. A behavior, a reaction, a relationship dynamic. How long did you last before the old pattern pulled you back? Not because you wanted it, but because it felt normal, comfortable, familiar. You tell yourself you'll change tomorrow. But tomorrow arrives and you do exactly what you did yesterday. Not because you're lazy, but because you're conditioned. And conditioning doesn't feel like control. It feels like identity, like reality. You say you're making progress, but how much of that progress is just movement inside the same loop? A slightly different version of the same response, the same escape with a new name. How many of your new choices are just familiar patterns in disguise? And if that's true, then what part of you is actually free? Even the way you ask questions is patterned. The kinds of doubts you allow, the thoughts you suppress before they even finish forming. Your mind builds walls, quietly, invisibly, to protect the structure it's built. You don't challenge those walls, you live inside them. Because tearing them down would feel like losing yourself. But what if that self is a construction? A collection of survival strategies and learned behaviors mistaken for a personality? Then who are you underneath it? You might say, I can stop any time I want. I can change. I've done it before. But that's just another pattern, the belief that you're in control, even when you're not. The illusion that your actions are conscious just because they feel deliberate. You forget that even your sense of deliberation can be trained. Even your sense of what feels right can be manufactured, conditioned, shaped over time by reward and punishment, praise and silence, success and shame, until what you think is right is just what you've been taught not to question, and what you think is freedom is just comfort. Wearing a mask. The more you look, the more unsettling it becomes. Because the idea that you're not really choosing, that your freedom is a practiced illusion, isn't just disturbing, it's threatening. If you're not choosing, then what does that make your regrets? Your guilt, your hopes for the future? If you're not free, then who is responsible? But maybe responsibility was never the point. Maybe the real question is something colder, something deeper. If your life is just a series of habits, stacked one on top of the other, then what would it take to break one? Not modify it, not replace it with a better one, but actually break it. Would it require pain, isolation, a total collapse of the systems that keep you functioning? Or is it even possible at all? Is the self you think you are so tied to those habits that breaking them would be indistinguishable from breaking you? Maybe that's why you hold on to them. Not because they serve you, but because you're scared of what exists beyond them, of the silence, the uncertainty, the raw, unfamiliar space where nothing is automatic, where you'd have to make a real choice. Not just a repeated one, but maybe you've never actually been there. Maybe you've spent your whole life living as a reaction and calling it freedom. What if the worst damage you ever caused was something you never questioned because you thought you were doing the right thing? That's the danger. Not in cruelty, not in indifference, but in conviction. In the quiet certainty that you're helping, that you're fixing something broken, that you're making the world better. You see it in small things. A parent disciplines a child for their own good. A friend tells a painful truth, believing it will help. A government intervenes, confident it's bringing peace. And in every case, there's a moment where the line blurs between help and harm, between kindness and control, between healing and domination. But you rarely notice when it happens, because when you think you're helping, you stop asking questions. You stop doubting your motives. You believe that pain is justified, that resistance means misunderstanding, that damage is necessary. You frame it all as sacrifice. And once you believe that, you can do anything. You can lie if the truth might hurt. You can shame if it motivates. You can manipulate, isolate, punish if the goal is transformation. You can cause harm as long as you believe it's for their benefit. Helping becomes the excuse, the shield, the mask. Because if someone accuses you, if they say you hurt them, you can always say, "I was trying to help." And that sounds noble. That sounds good. But it's also untouchable. It blocks accountability. It recasts harm as virtue. And this is where the danger grows. When you convince yourself that harm is help, you lose the ability to see the difference. You believe you're saving someone, even as they pull away. You think they're resisting healing, when they're really protecting themselves. You see their fear as weakness, their anger as ingratitude, their silence as a challenge, and you double down. You push harder. You insist more. You escalate. Because if they don't change, then what was the point of your effort? Their transformation becomes necessary, not just for them, but for you, for your belief in your own goodness, your need to be the hero. But what if your help is unwanted? What if your solution isn't right? What if you're treating wounds you don't understand? It doesn't matter, because in your mind, they need you, even if they say no. And now you're not helping, you're controlling. You say it's love, you say it's care, but it's about making someone fit the image you have of who they should be. It's about fixing them, reshaping them, improving them, until they finally reflect the world you want to live in. And if they resist, you don't stop. You blame them. You say they're ungrateful. You say they don't know what's best. You tell yourself that real help requires force, that sometimes people need to be saved from themselves. But maybe that's the most dangerous thought of all, because if you believe someone needs saving, and you also believe you're the one to save them, then you've already made a decision. You've already removed their voice from the equation. You've already replaced their autonomy with your judgment, their pain with your plan, their truth with your assumption. You don't see it as violence, you see it as compassion. But that's the trick. Harm doesn't always come with anger, or cruelty, or hatred. Sometimes it comes gently. Sometimes it comes with kind eyes and soft words and the unbearable weight of someone else's certainty. And it's difficult to fight against that, because if you push back, you're told you're being resistant. If you express pain, you're told it's growing pains. If you say stop, you're told it's fear talking. And if you finally break down, they'll say you needed that it was necessary, that it worked, because from their perspective, your suffering was a step towards salvation. They can't see the damage. And maybe you've done this yourself, not out of malice, not out of control, but because you were trying to help. And in trying, you stopped listening. You ignored signs. You dismissed boundaries. You thought you were doing the right thing, and maybe you were at first, but intention isn't protection. Believing you're helping doesn't mean you're not doing harm. And the moment you assume you know what's best for someone else, the moment your belief overrides their voice, you become the danger you thought you were saving them from. And worst of all, you might never realize it, because it never looks like harm when you're the one doing it. It just looks like love. What if the moment you try to control something is the exact moment you lose it? You tighten your grip. You overthink every word, every move. You monitor your thoughts, your emotions, the way you appear, the way others respond. You double-check your plans, rehearse your lines, repeat your routines. You call it preparation, discipline, focus, but slowly, without noticing, the world around you starts to blur. The things you wanted to keep close begins slipping away. You don't see it at first. You feel productive, safe, efficient. You tell yourself that control is the only way to keep chaos at bay, the only way to protect what matters. But underneath that calm surface, a quiet desperation is forming. Your muscles stay tense. Your sleep gets shorter. Your smile becomes more rehearsed. You start bracing for outcomes that haven't happened. You start preparing for people to fail you, abandon you, disappoint you before they ever have. You think you're staying ahead. You think you're reducing risk, but you're not. You're just shifting the fear. You're carrying it everywhere you go. It's no longer about the problem. It's about not being caught off guard, not being seen as vulnerable, not letting anything slip through. You forget what you were trying to protect in the first place. You forget why you cared at all, and then something breaks. A conversation turns cold. A relationship starts to falter. A project spirals out of your hands. You feel betrayed by the very thing you tried hardest to manage. You want to say, "I did everything right." You want to say, "I controlled for every variable." But now the failure feels personal, not just painful, but like a violation. You blame yourself for not holding on tighter, and in doing so you grip even harder next time. You start treating people like variables. You scan for signs of danger in every sentence, every silence. You correct small behaviors. You anticipate needs that were never spoken. You try to remove all uncertainty, all ambiguity, all chance. You stop listening for what's real. You listen only for what confirms your fears. And that becomes your reality. You don't trust anymore, not really. You perform trust. You say the right things. You appear calm, but your eyes scan the room for threats. You nod while holding your breath. You respond with kindness while rehearsing escape plans in your head. Your world becomes smaller, narrower, less alive. You convince yourself this is strength, maturity, wisdom, but it's not. It's fear, hardened into habit. And slowly the people around you change. They withdraw, they go quiet. Not because you push them away, but because they feel something they can't name, like they're being managed, like they're not trusted, like they're not quite free in your presence. And even though you say all the right things, they feel the pressure, the need to act a certain way, the invisible weight of your expectations. So they adapt. They stop telling you certain things. They give you versions of themselves that feel safe, inoffensive, controlled. You start wondering why you feel so alone, why things feel so rehearsed, why the closeness you crave feels further than ever. But you don't ask. You tighten the system. You work harder. You set new boundaries, clearer rules, more structure. You convince yourself that once things settle, the peace will return. But it doesn't. It can't. Because peace doesn't come from control. It comes from presence, from trust, from letting people surprise you, letting life disappoint you, letting yourself be hurt, and choosing to stay open anyway. But control doesn't allow for that. It doesn't allow for uncertainty, or ambiguity, or change. It treats life like a system to be solved, not a mystery to be experienced. And every time you try to solve it, you kill something essential. The aliveness, the spontaneity, the vulnerability that makes anything worth holding on to. You think you're protecting yourself from chaos, but you're not. You're suffocating under the weight of your own vigilance. You're losing the very things you tried to preserve. Not because you didn't care enough, but because you cared too much to let them breathe. And maybe that's the hardest truth to face. That the thing you feared, the loss, the disconnection, the collapse, was never the real threat. The real threat was your reaction to it, the way you tried to prevent it, the way you believed love or success or peace could only exist if you managed every detail. So you're left with this: the deeper your need for control, the more life begins to feel like something slipping through your fingers. Not because you let go, but because you never allowed it to be free in the first place. What if you didn't exist until someone else believed that you did? Not in the physical sense. You're still there, you're breathing, you're thinking, but in the minds of others, you're a blank space, invisible, irrelevant, like background noise. You could speak, move, even scream, but without acknowledgement, you begin to feel unreal, like you're slowly fading. Now imagine someone turns toward you. They really look at you. They ask you a question. They don't need to ask. They listen, not politely, but fully, as though your words might carry something they need. And in that moment, something shifts. You feel more solid, like you've been pulled into focus, as if their belief in you gave you weight. At first, this feels like connection. But what if it's more than that? What if other people's belief isn't just affirmation, it's construction? What if who you are can only form in the space between how you see yourself and how someone else reflects you back? You start noticing it everywhere. The way you become funnier when someone expects you to be. The way you rise to a challenge when someone believes you will. The way you seem smarter, braver, kinder, not because you changed, but because someone else saw it first. You think you're being authentic, but that version of you only exists because someone believed it into being, and that's the disturbing part. You are not a fixed identity, you are a possibility, activated by recognition. What does that mean for the times you were overlooked, dismissed, ignored? Did parts of you simply never emerge? Did they remain dormant, unformed, because no one ever reached for them? And what if the opposite is also true? What if someone believed something awful about you, and it began to shape who you were, not because it was true, but because it was believed? You begin to realize how porous your identity is, how easily shaped, how dependent. You want to think of yourself as an independent mind, self-contained, self-created. But so much of who you are is reactive, constructed in response to others, made visible by the mirror of their attention. When no one believes in you, you begin to disbelieve in yourself, not intellectually, not immediately, but slowly, like a quiet erosion. You start to speak less, try less, feel less, not because you've changed inside, but because the world no longer reflects back someone worth effort. And then someone sees you again, not fully, just enough. They notice something, and for a moment you begin to exist more clearly. You feel the edges of yourself again. You feel real, but now you see the trap. If your reality sharpens when others believe in you, what happens when they withdraw, when they forget you, when their attention shifts? You begin chasing it, trying to maintain belief, adjusting yourself, performing, becoming what is expected, just to remain visible. You stop being yourself and start being whatever keeps their gaze on you. And in doing so, you become less real, not more, because you are no longer formed by belief. You are trapped by it. There is no freedom in being seen, if your existence depends on staying seen. But you also can't fully exist without it. You can't isolate your identity from the world and expect it to hold shape. You need belief. You need it like oxygen, not for ego, not for praise, but for coherence. You exist in fragments until someone helps you assemble them. You need them to hold pieces of you that you can't see on your own. And yet, the most painful truth is this: not everyone you need to believe in you will. You will show parts of yourself that go unnoticed. You will wait to be seen and remain unseen. And in those moments, it will feel like you are disappearing, like something essential is being lost. And maybe it is. Maybe there are versions of you that will never form because they were never believed into being. Maybe you will never be the person you could have been because the right eyes never found you. But maybe the opposite is also true, that some parts of you only exist because someone unexpected saw something no one else did. That belief, when it comes, is a kind of creation, and that even if it's brief, it makes something permanent. You can't return to who you were before someone believed in you. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. You are not just influenced by others. You are authored by them, shaped, revealed, and sometimes rescued, not because they gave you something you didn't have, but because they believed something into you and made it real. What if you found out your memory was lying to you? Not just about the details, not just about what you wore or what someone said, but about the very structure of who you are. What if the thoughts you trust, the judgments you make, the things you believe with total confidence were wrong, consistently, predictably, in ways you can't feel or see? You already know the science. You know your brain makes errors. You know about false memories, cognitive biases, blind spots. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something deeper. Imagine you're having an argument. You feel certain you're right. Every part of your mind agrees. Your voice gets firmer, your chest tightens, and you fight harder because you know the truth is on your side. But an hour later, or a day, you find out you were wrong. Completely. Maybe even embarrassingly so. But here's the thing. In that moment, you didn't feel wrong. You didn't feel confused. You felt clarity. You felt certainty. And now that moment is gone, but the feeling of being right remains suspiciously familiar, because it didn't come from the facts. It came from inside you, from a sensation. And that sensation is still there, whispering in your ear every time you make a choice. Now pause, let that sink in. Your internal sense of truth, the feeling that something makes sense, or is obvious, or is good, is not a compass. It's a hallucination. And even knowing that, you still believe it, you still follow it. You might say, well, I check myself. I double check. I ask for feedback. But who chose what to double check? Who decided which feedback to accept? You did, using the same flawed tool. It's like using a broken ruler to measure itself. There's no exit from this loop. Every correction still starts from you, from your perception, from your deeply biased, endlessly filtered, highly selective internal world. And that's not an abstract idea. It's terrifyingly practical. You trust your judgment when you decide who to love, who to fear, what's fair, what's true. You make decisions with consequences about relationships, work, morality, based on a mind you know is untrustworthy. You don't feel like you're guessing. You feel like you're knowing. But really, you're just leaning further into the illusion. Think about how often you feel certain about something that later turns out false. Now think about all the things you feel certain about right now. How would you know which ones are wrong? How would you feel the difference? You wouldn't. Because false certainty feels identical to real certainty. So what do? Do you try to doubt everything? Try to live without confidence? Try to second-guess every belief? That's just another trick, another false certainty, this time the certainty of your own doubt. The problem isn't belief or disbelief. It's that the feeling of truth itself is unreliable. It doesn't come from reality. It comes from your mind, and your mind is not built for accuracy. It's built for survival, for efficiency, for emotional comfort, for reinforcing what you already think. So even when you try to be objective, careful, fair, You're still just rearranging your own illusions, using reason not to see more clearly, but to protect the identity you've already formed. Because underneath it all, you don't really want the truth. You want the version of truth that lets you feel like you're good, like you're right, like your life makes sense. And every time that version is challenged by someone's words, by a new fact, by an uncomfortable question, your mind resists. Automatically, silently, without asking your permission. You already know this happens. You've seen it in others. You've watched people twist themselves into contradictions to protect a belief. But do you really think you're any different? You think your reasoning is clearer, your self-awareness stronger, your motives purer. But that's just another belief, another illusion, another layer of trust placed in the one system that's already fooled you countless times. And still, you trust it. Still, you make decisions. Still, you live your life guided by feelings that have no guarantee of being real. You could say, well, that's the human condition. That's just how it is. But that doesn't make it less disturbing. It just means the disturbance is universal. Everyone is moving through the world in a dream of certainty, mistaking sensation for truth, and there's no way out. Because even now, hearing this, you're not doubting your most sacred beliefs. You're using those beliefs to judge this thought. You're measuring this script with the same flawed ruler, and it feels fair. It feels reasonable. It feels right, but it isn't right. It's just familiar. And maybe the scariest part of all is this. If your sense of reality is just a sensation, and that sensation is broken, then how would you ever know? Maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you never have. What does it actually take to change? Not superficially, not when you're inspired or motivated or curious. But when something inside you truly shifts, when you finally do the thing you've been putting off for years, or stop the habit you swore you'd quit 100 times already. Most people think change comes from clarity, from insight, from learning the truth, or finally understanding what's been holding them back. But that's not true, at least not in any way that lasts, because clarity without pain is just theory. It stays in your head. It doesn't touch your behavior. You might talk differently, think differently, maybe even make a plan, but you don't change. Not really. You just wait. You keep hoping the truth will be enough. But then the pain comes. Something collapses. Something breaks. You're humiliated, betrayed, abandoned. You hit a wall. You reach a point where continuing the way you've been living hurts more than the fear of trying something else. And then suddenly, the thing that felt impossible for years becomes inevitable. Not because you're stronger or wiser or better prepared, but because there's nowhere else to go. You don't stop drinking because it's bad for you. You stop because it destroys your job or your family or your body. You don't leave the toxic relationship because you realized it was unhealthy. You leave because staying has started to feel like dying. And that's the part no one wants to admit. That change doesn't come when you're ready. It comes when you're desperate. When the cost of staying the same finally outweighs the terror of becoming something new. Sometimes it's gradual, quiet, like erosion, a slow wearing down of your excuses. Other times it's sharp, sudden, a moment you can't undo, a betrayal, a diagnosis, a moment of collapse that shows you exactly how much damage your choices have already done. And from that point forward, the story you've been telling yourself about who you are doesn't work anymore. You try to ignore it. At first, you tell yourself it's just temporary. You'll fix it later. But the pressure keeps building. The guilt, the fear, the shame, the sense that you've been lying to yourself for too long, that the version of you who made all these decisions doesn't exist anymore, and that maybe they never really did. Eventually, you stop trying to go back. You stop pretending that things can return to how they were, and the only direction left is forward into something unfamiliar, something that hurts in a different way, but hurts a little less than staying still. And here's the disturbing part. Sometimes the only way to reach that point is through suffering. You don't change because someone showed you the light. You change because the darkness got unbearable. There's a lie we tell ourselves that we're always free to choose, that we could change any time we wanted if we just cared enough. But that's not how it works. Most of the time, change doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like collapse, like surrender, like your body or your mind finally refusing to let you continue the way you've been living. You don't wake up and decide to become a better person. You wake up and realize you've become someone you can't stand anymore. And still, even then, the shift isn't immediate. You drag your feet, you relapse, you stall, because the pain of change is real too. It's just slightly less unbearable than the pain of staying the same. That's the hidden equation, the tipping point. Change happens when the pain of not changing becomes more intense, more constant, more unbearable than the fear of changing. And once that threshold is crossed, everything shifts. Habits that felt permanent dissolve. Attachments that felt essential fade. Suddenly, the idea of staying the same feels like suffocation. You stop because continuing hurts more. You start because not starting would destroy you. And maybe that's the only way it was ever going to happen. Maybe the real question isn't why change is so hard. Maybe it's why you waited so long to let it hurt enough. What if you're wrong, but not by mistake? What if you're wrong because you're sure you're right? Not uncertain, not guessing, but confident, fully convinced. Every instinct says you understand what's happening. Every thought affirms it. The evidence looks clear, the conclusion feels obvious, until it isn't. That's the moment everything starts to fall apart. The thing you were certain of, the truth you believed, suddenly slips. Just a little, not enough to collapse, but enough to wobble, enough to make you pause. You still believe you're right, but the edge of that belief has frayed. You can't see it clearly anymore, but you're still holding on. Now, someone shows you something, a fact, a contradiction, an angle you hadn't considered. It doesn't just challenge your belief, it reverses it. It shows you how wrong you were, and how right you thought you were while being wrong. It makes you feel naive, exposed, vulnerable. You thought the truth would feel solid. You thought you'd recognize it. But now, you start to see that truth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind what feels obvious. Sometimes the lie feels natural, and the truth feels strange. You remember moments like this, when you learned something you didn't want to believe, when you argued, defended, resisted, until something broke inside. Not just your opinion, but your certainty. You saw yourself clearly, not just as someone who was wrong, but as someone who didn't know they were wrong until it was too late. It's not just about facts, it's about how easily your mind fills in gaps, completes patterns, creates explanations. You rarely notice how quickly it jumps to conclusions, until one of those conclusions turns out to be completely false. Now the question changes. It's not, am I right? It's, how would I know if I wasn't? And suddenly, you don't have an answer. Because doubt doesn't always arrive with a warning. Sometimes it sneaks in quietly, disguised as confidence. And once you've built your identity around a belief, especially a moral one, it becomes harder to see it clearly. You stop questioning, not because the answer is certain, but because uncertainty is painful. You realize now that you've made choices before, ethical, emotional, practical, based on things you later discovered were false. Not just slightly inaccurate, but completely backwards. You trusted the wrong person. You misread someone's intentions. You misjudged a situation. And in that moment, you weren't being careless or reckless. You were being logical, thoughtful, human, and that's the problem. Being wrong doesn't feel wrong in the moment. It feels like clarity, until the reversal comes, until the logic turns back on itself and exposes the cracks. And you're left wondering how many of your current beliefs will feel absurd in hindsight. What are you sure of now? What do you believe so deeply that you never question it? What if one of those beliefs is completely false, and you just haven't seen the contradiction yet? You think of the arguments you've had, the things you've said with conviction, the judgments you've made, the trust you've placed. How much of that was built on a foundation that only felt like truth? And worse, how many people do you think are wrong right now, simply because they don't see what you see? But what if the only difference between you and them is perspective? What if their certainty feels exactly like yours? You start to understand that truth isn't always about who has the best reasoning. Sometimes it's about who asks the hardest questions, not of others, but of themselves. Because asking, "Am I wrong?" is easy when you already suspect it. But asking it when you're sure you're right, that's something else. That requires breaking something inside. It requires stepping outside your own mind and seeing how small your view really is. But how often do you actually do that? How often do you stop in the middle of certainty and ask yourself, what am I not seeing? The answer is probably not enough. And maybe that's the real trap. Not ignorance, not misinformation, but the illusion of knowing, the quiet confidence that you're on the side of truth, when really you're just standing where your past decisions placed you. Because the hardest truth to face is the one that makes you question all the others. The one that shows you how often you've mistaken clarity for correctness. How often you've taken feeling right as being right. How often you've stood on the wrong side of something, fully believing you were on the right one. And now even this thought, the one you're having right now, could be wrong. But you won't know it. Not until it's too late.